Hey, welcome back. Come on in, get comfortable, and settle in for tonight. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, and I keep coming back to the same thought. How much of what we think we know about the past is actually just the version someone wanted us to believe? Tonight, we're going back to the Victorian era, and I want to warn you right now, it is not the story you have seen in the movies. No sweeping ballroom gowns and candle-lit dinners with charming gentlemen. No Jane Austen love letters and happy endings, stitched up neat and tidy. What I want to tell you tonight is the story underneath all of that. The story that did not make it into the paintings. The story of what it actually felt like to be a woman inside a Victorian home in the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. And here's the thing that got me the detail that made me stop and really think. At the height of the British Empire, when Queen Victoria herself sat on the throne as the most powerful ruler on earth, the women living beneath her reign could not open a bank account, could not sign a contract, could not keep the money they earned with their own two hands, could not even legally own the dress on their back if they were married. Let that sit for a moment. The queen of the most powerful nation on earth, and the women in that nation had almost no rights at all. That paradox, that extraordinary, almost dizzying contradiction is where our story begins tonight. The Victorian era technically runs from 1837 to 1901, 64 years, nearly the entire second half of the 19th century. And in those 64 years, Britain built railways across entire continents, sent explorers to the ends of the earth, and produced some of the greatest literature, science, and art in human history. It was also one of the most suffocating periods in recorded history to be a woman. Now, I want to be careful here because the Victorian era is one of those historical periods that people tend to romanticize. And honestly, I get it. The aesthetics are beautiful. The architecture is stunning. If you have ever walked through a Victorian neighborhood at dusk with these brick facades and warm lamp light glowing in the windows, it does feel like stepping into something almost magical. But the thing about romanticizing an era is that you tend to stand outside of it and look at the pretty window without thinking too hard about what was happening on the other side of the glass. So, tonight we're going through the window. We're stepping inside. To understand what life was really like for women in Victorian homes, you first need to understand the idea that ruled everything. And I mean everything. The law, the medicine, the religion, the education, the architecture, even the clothing. It was called the doctrine of separate spheres. The premise was elegantly simple and deeply convenient if you were a man designing the rules. Anyway, society, it was argued, had two distinct worlds. There was the public sphere, the world of business, politics, law, commerce, intellectual life. That was the man's world. And then there was the private sphere, the home, the hearth, the children, the quiet domestic interior. That was the woman's world. And these two worlds were not supposed to overlap. Men went out into the harsh, competitive, morally compromised world every day and did the difficult work of running civilization. Women stayed home and created a sanctuary, a soft, clean, morally pure space to which those men could return each evening to be restored. On its face, it almost sounds considerate, like you go out and wrestle with the world, dear, and I will make sure dinner is warm and the house is lovely when you return. But here's what that arrangement actually meant in practice. A woman's entire identity, her entire purpose, her entire legal and social existence was defined by that domestic space. She was not a citizen with rights. She was a manager of a household, a moral ornament, a symbol of her husband's success and respectability. And the moment she stepped outside of that role, the entire apparatus of Victorian society came down on her. I want to talk about the law for a moment, because I think this is where the reality really starts to land. Before 1882, when a woman in England married, she essentially ceased to exist as a legal person. Not metaphorically, not in an abstract feminist theory sense. I mean literally under the actual written law of the land. Her legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. There is a famous definition written by the English jurist William Blackton Back in 1765, and it was still the operating principle of Victorian family law well into the 19th century. He wrote that by marriage the very being or legal existence of a woman is suspended or at least incorporated into that of her husband. Suspended, not limited, not restricted. suspended like it simply went on pause, like a life you could put on hold until the law decided otherwise. What did that mean in practice? It meant that anything a woman owned before she got married, her savings, her clothes, her jewelry, any property she inherited from her family legally transferred to her husband on her wedding day. Not because he asked for it, not because she agreed, because the law said so. It meant that any money she earned after marriage, from selling crafts, from working as a governess, from any labor at all, belonged to him the moment she received it. She could not keep it. She could not spend it without his approval. She could not open a bank account in her own name. It meant she could not sign a lease, could not initiate a lawsuit, could not make a will. And it meant, and this is the part that still genuinely unsettles me, that even her children were legally his property. If a marriage ended, the father had automatic custody. The mother had no claim to her own children. Now, when I first started really digging into the specifics of all this, my first instinct was to think, well, yes, but surely this only applied in the most extreme cases. Surely most marriages were loving partnerships, and the law was just a technicality nobody actually invoked. And I had to correct myself, because that line of thinking is actually one of the most common mistakes we make when we look at history. We assume that because something was rarely enforced harshly, it was rarely harmful. But there is another kind of harm, quieter, more constant, more deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life. The harm of knowing what the law says about you. The harm of living every single day with the awareness that your security, your children, your financial survival, all of it depends entirely on the goodwill of one person. That is not a technicality. That is the architecture of a life. And what is fascinating and honestly kind of heartbreaking is that many Victorian women genuinely believe this arrangement was correct. Not just accepted it, believed it. That is the real power of an ideology. It does not need to lock you in a room. It just needs to convince you that you belong there. Women were taught from childhood that the domestic sphere was their natural calling, that their softness, their emotionality, their capacity for nurturing these were not limitations. They were gifts, special feminine gifts that made women uniquely suited to the sacred work of the home. A writer named Sarah Stickney Ellis published an enormously influential series of books in the 1840s. Books with titles like The Wives of England and The Mothers of England and The Daughters of England essentially conduct manuals for how a proper Victorian woman should think and behave. And in them she wrote that women must be content to be inferior to men, not reluctantly inferior, contentedly inferior, as though the key to happiness was simply making peace with your place. These books sold by the hundreds of thousands. They were given as gifts at weddings. They sat on parlor shelves alongside the Bible. And here's the detail I keep turning over in my mind. Sarah Stickney Ellis was herself a published author, a working writer, a woman who earned her own income from her words. And yet the message she was selling was, stay home, be quiet, ask nothing for yourself. I'm not saying she was cynical. I genuinely think she believed what she wrote. And that to me is the most revealing thing of all. When a system has existed long enough, even the people it constrains become its most loyal defenders. Now, I mentioned at the start that this was the most powerful empire in the world, and that is important context, because Victorian England was not just a domestic story. It was a global story. By the mid-9th century, Britain controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. The wealth flowing into London was staggering, and that wealth built the middle class, a new prosperous aspirational class of merchants and professionals who were the primary audience for everything we associate with Victorian domesticity. For middle-class families, the home was not just a place to live. It was a statement. It was the visible proof of a family's respectability, their values, their standing in the community. And who was responsible for that statement? The wife. She was the one who managed the household, who made sure the curtains were clean and the silver was polished and the children were well behaved and the meals were served correctly. She was, in a very real sense, the brand manager of the family's public image. Only she received no salary for it, no credit, no recognition outside the walls of the home. When her husband rose in society, it was his success, the fact that she had made that rise possible by freeing him from every domestic responsibility, by creating the stable home from which he could operate, by raising the children and managing the staff and maintaining the relationships. None of that counted because she was just doing what was natural. She was just fulfilling her sphere. And I think this is where the real emotional weight of this story lives. Not in the dramatic injustices, though. Those are real, and we will get into them in detail as we go. But in this quieter, more pervasive thing, the eraser, the invisibility. Think about what it means to spend your entire adult life working hard at something, and have that work be categorically defined as not work. To be competent, intelligent, capable, and have all of those capacities channeled exclusively into a space that the world has agreed does not count. Victorian women were not, by and large, sitting idle. Running a household in the 19th century was genuinely difficult, labor-intensive work. Before the age of the modern appliances, cold dust from the stoves coated everything. The windows, the furniture, the curtains. Laundry was done by hand in zinc tubs, often for hours. Curtains were taken down and washed every 2 weeks, and they were so blackened by cold smoke. They sometimes had to be soaked in salted water, first just to loosen the grime. Food had to be prepared from scratch every single day. But none of that was considered real work. Real work was what a husband did. The woman was simply present, simply maintaining. And that framing, that categorization had consequences that rippled far beyond the individual household. It shaped how women were educated, what they were allowed to dream, what they believed themselves capable of, and perhaps most critically, what they believed they deserved. One of the things I find most striking about this period, and I've thought about this a lot, is how perfectly designed it all was. Not designed by any single person, not some Victorian villain twirling his mustache and plotting women's oppression, but designed by accumulated habit, economic incentive, religious tradition, and legal precedent, all reinforcing each other over centuries. The ideology said women belonged at home. So women were not educated for anything outside the home. Because they were not educated, they could not support themselves if they left. Because they could not support themselves, they had no choice but to marry. Because they had to marry, they were entirely dependent on their husbands. And because they were entirely dependent on their husbands, the law felt comfortable giving those husbands near total control. Every part of the system held every other part in place. It was not a cage with a visible lock. It was a cage made entirely out of the assumption that this was just how things were, how things had always been, how things were meant to be. And if you grew up inside that cage, if you were born into it, educated within it, married inside it, raised your children there, how would you even know it was a cage? That, I think, is the most quietly devastating question of the entire Victorian era. Over the next several parts of tonight's story, we're going to look at exactly how this system worked and how women experienced it from the inside. We're going to look at the laws, the medicine, the marriages, the children, the hidden rebellions, and the slow, painful, extraordinary revolution that began to crack this world open from within. Because here's the thing about the Victorian era that actually gives me hope. Every time I study it, those women were not passive. They were not simply accepting. They were struggling quietly and constantly against something enormous. And some of them found the most extraordinary, creative, courageous ways to push back. But first, we need to understand exactly what they were pushing back against. And the place to start is with a poem. A poem so famous, so beloved, and so dangerous that decades later, one of England's greatest writers said she had to murder it before she could think clearly. That poem had a name that sounded perfectly innocent. It was called The Angel in the House, and it may have done more damage to more women than any law parliament ever passed. So that poem, I mentioned it at the end of the last part, and I want to come back to it properly, because I think if there's one single cultural artifact that captures everything wrong with how Victorian society thought about women, this is it. The Angel in the House, published by Coventry Patmore in 1854. Now, before I tell you what is in it, I want to ask you something. Have you ever heard a compliment that the more you thought about it, the more it started to feel like an insult? The kind of thing that sounds like praise on the surface, but is actually a very elegant way of keeping someone in their place. That is this poem. Coventry Patmore was a poet, a librarian at the British Museum, and by all accounts, a man who genuinely believed he was honoring women. The poem was written as a tribute to his wife, Emily. It was a love poem in the traditional sense, and in the culture of the time, it was received as exactly that, a beautiful romantic celebration of feminine virtue. The poem tells the story of a courtship and marriage and in it Patmore describes his ideal wife with a kind of reverent, almost worshipful devotion. She is gentle. She is pure. She is patient. She exists in the poem entirely in relation to the men around her, as daughter, then as wife, then as mother. And here's the specific thing that made this poem so insidious. It did not say women were inferior. It said women were morally superior, purer, more spiritual, closer to heaven almost. On the surface, that sounds like a step up. But think about what that argument was actually being used to justify. Women are too good for the dirty, competitive, morally compromised public world. They're too pure for business and law and politics. Their spiritual gifts are best preserved in the home away from all that ugliness. Do you see how that works? The compliment and the cage are the same thing. The praise is the prison. The poem became one of the most widely circulated pieces of writing in the entire Victorian era. By some estimates, between 1854 and the end of the century, it went through dozens of editions and sold hundreds of thousands of copies across Britain and America both. It was quoted in sermons. It was referenced in conduct manuals. Young women were encouraged to read it as a model for the kind of wife they should aspire to become. The title itself, Angel in the House, entered the language as a common phrase, a shorthand for the ideal Victorian wife. A woman who was endlessly patient, endlessly giving, endlessly self-effacing. A woman who had no needs that inconvenienced anyone. A woman who existed in some sense, not as a person at all, but as a function, a warmth-generating, comfort-providing, morally stabilizing function. And when I say it entered the language, I mean it really did. Women began to describe themselves using this framework. Men began to evaluate potential wives against this standard. The phrase showed up in court cases, in medical literature, in divorce proceedings. If a woman behaved in ways that deviated too dramatically from the angel ideal, if she was too assertive, too intellectual, too sexually independent, too financially ambitious, that deviation could and would be used as evidence against her in legal settings. The poem was not just popular, it was operational. Now, fast forward to 1931. Virginia Woolf, one of the greatest writers Britain ever produced, gave a speech to a group of professional women. And in it, she made a confession that I think is one of the most honest and surprising things any writer has ever said publicly. She said that whenever she sat down to write, she found herself haunted by a presence, a kind of internal voice, and she described that voice in very specific terms. It was sympathetic. It was charming. It was utterly unselfish. It flattered. It deceived. It encouraged her to be agreeable, to soften her opinions, to never let anyone see that she had a mind of her own that might challenge or disturb. And she said she recognized that presence. She called it the angel in the house. Then she said something extraordinary. She said she had to kill it, that before she could write a single honest sentence, she had to locate that voice in herself and strangle it. Because if she did not, it would have plucked the heart out of everything she wrote. Now, think about when Virginia Woolf was speaking. This is 1931. Patmore's poem was published in 1854. That is 77 years. Nearly 8 decades have passed since this poem first circulated. And Virginia Woolf, educated, brilliant, living in a completely different world from the mid-Victorian women we're talking about tonight, was still fighting that voice inside herself. That to me is the real measure of how deeply this ideology had been planted. Not in laws you could repeal, not in institutions you could dismantle, but inside the minds of the women themselves. So what did the angel actually look like in practice? Not the poem. Real life, because it is one thing to write beautifully about a wife who radiates pure goodness. It is another thing to be that wife on a Tuesday morning when the coal stove has gone out and the baby has not slept and your husband is irritable about something that happened at his office and expects you to absorb all of that quietly and return to him only warmth. The conduct literature of the Victorian era, and there was a lot of it, an absolute mountain of it, was surprisingly specific about what the angel was supposed to do and feel on a practical day-to-day level. She was supposed to manage the household entirely, but invisibly. Her management was supposed to be so seamless that it felt effortless. Her husband was not meant to notice the logistics. He was meant to come home and find everything simply right. Dinner at the right time, children clean and presentable, the house calm and orderly. If something went wrong, if dinner was late, if a servant made a mistake, if a child misbehaved, That was the wife's failure, her visible failure, because the household was her domain and therefore her responsibility. But if everything went right, that was simply Tuesday, simply how things were supposed to be. Nothing special, nothing worth remarking on. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from doing important work in a system that refuses to recognize it as work at all. And I have been thinking about this a lot lately, actually, because it is not entirely a historical phenomenon. But in the Victorian era, that erasure was not just cultural, it was codified. It was built into the law, the medicine, the religion, and the language itself. Let me tell you about a woman named Eliza Lynn Linton. Linton was a journalist, one of the first salaried female journalists in England. Actually, she worked for the Saturday Review in the 1860s, and she was sharp, prolific, and genuinely talented. She also wrote one of the most controversial pieces of the entire Victorian era, an 1868 essay called The Girl of the Period. In this essay, Linton absolutely savaged the modern young woman. She accused her of being vain, shallow, obsessed with fashion and flirtation, uninterested in the domestic virtues that made a good wife and mother. She held up the idealized English girl of the past, quiet, modest, home-loving, as the standard from which the current generation had catastrophically fallen. The essay caused a sensation. It was reprinted, debated, responded to, argued over. Society ladies quoted it approvingly at dinner parties. Young women wrote furious letters to newspapers in response. But here's what makes this story genuinely fascinating to me, and what I think most people miss when they encounter it. Eliza Lynn Linton, who wrote passionately about how women should embrace their domestic calling, had herself fled a miserable marriage after just 2 years separated from her husband, and spent the rest of her long life supporting herself entirely through her own work and her own intellect. She never went back to the domestic sphere she championed so publicly. She lived independently, traveled extensively, formed deep intellectual friendships with men and women across London's literary world. She did not live the life she prescribed for other women, not even close. And I do not say that to condemn her human beings are complicated, and the pressures that shaped her public positions were real. But it is one of the most revealing contradictions I've ever encountered in this period, because it shows exactly how far the angel ideal was from lived reality, even for the women who defended it most loudly. What I find myself coming back to the more I read about this is a question about sincerity. How many Victorian women genuinely internalized the angel ideal, and how many were simply performing it, wearing it as a kind of protective coloring, the way you learn to present what is expected of you in order to survive a system? And the honest answer is we cannot fully know, because the very nature of that performance was that it left very little trace. Women's inner lives in this period are by historical standards remarkably difficult to recover. Diaries were kept, yes, but often with the knowledge that they might be read by husbands or family members. Letters were written, but carefully. Most of what women felt in private was either never written down or written down and then destroyed. What we have mostly is the public record, the conduct manuals, the poems, the legal documents, the medical case notes. And those sources by definition tell us what society wanted women to be far more clearly than they tell us what women actually were. But occasionally you find something that slips through, a diary entry with an unguarded moment, a letter with a sentence that obviously went further than the writer intended, a memoir written late in life when there was nothing left to lose. And in those moments, you catch a glimpse of something real, something that was there all along underneath the performance. A woman who was tired. A woman who was furious and had nowhere to put it. A woman who was so much more than the role she'd been handed, and who knew it and had no idea what to do with that knowledge. There is a woman named Florence Nightingale, and yes, you know her name. Everyone does. But I want to tell you something about her that tends to get left out of the famous story. Before Florence Nightingale went to the Crimea and became the lady with the lamp, before she revolutionized nursing and became one of the most celebrated women in the world, she spent more than a decade trapped in exactly the angel and the house dynamic we've been describing. She was born in 1820 into a wealthy, cultured English family. Her father was unusually progressive. He educated both Florence and her sister in Greek, Latin, mathematics, philosophy, history, and multiple languages. Florence was brilliant. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with her could see it. And she knew from a relatively young age that she wanted to work, specifically that she felt called to work in nursing, which at the time was considered a deeply disreputable profession, associated with the uneducated, the poor, and occasionally the morally suspect. Her family was horrified. For years, Florence Nightingale was pressured, pleaded with, and emotionally manipulated by the people who loved her most into staying home, staying respectable, fulfilling the role her class and her sex demanded of her. Her mother wanted her to marry. Her sister thought nursing was beneath them. The social expectation was suffocating and constant. In her private writings from this period, which were only published much later, Nightingale described what that decade felt like with a raw, almost shocking honesty. She wrote about the way time would pass in an upper-ass household, with nothing of any substance accomplished, visitors arriving and departing, needlework done, and undone meals, eaten, social calls made and returned. She wrote about what it felt like to have a mind that wanted to work in a world that insisted at rest. She was not dramatic about it. She was precise, clinical almost in the way she dissected her own frustration. But the pain in those pages is completely legible across a century and a half of distance. She called those years her nightmare, not a metaphor, her actual nightmare. And Florence Nightingale was one of the lucky ones. She eventually got out. She had a father who, despite the family's initial resistance, ultimately supported her when it mattered. She had the resources and the determination to push through. Most women did not have that. Most women stayed inside the dream that was not a dream at all. I want to pause here and be honest about something, because I think it would be too easy and honestly too convenient to look at this from the outside and simply shake our heads at how backward it all was. The angel in the house ideology did not survive and flourish for 64 years because Victorian people were uniquely cruel or uniquely stupid. It survived because it answered real needs. It gave meaning to an enormous amount of invisible labor. It provided a framework for social stability in a period of disorienting rapid change, industrialization, urbanization, empire, science, questioning religion. The home really was for many people a genuine refuge. And women in that era were not simply victims of a story that happened to them. Many of them were active, intelligent participants in shaping that story, even when they were doing so within severe constraints. The question was never really whether women were capable. It was whether the world was willing to see it. That gap between what women were and what the world was willing to acknowledge is where all the quiet struggle lived. By the end of the Victorian era, Patmore's poem was beginning to look different to a new generation of women. The daughters and granddaughters of the women who had read it adoringly were starting to ask questions the poem had never anticipated. If the angel was so pure, so morally elevated, why did she have no legal rights? If the domestic sphere was so sacred and important, why did it carry no financial value? If a woman's influence over her family was so powerful and so crucial, why was she not trusted with any influence beyond her front door? The poem did not have answers to those questions. It had never needed to because no one had been supposed to ask them. But women were asking them quietly at first, and then less quietly in drawing rooms, and in pamphlets and courtrooms, and in lecture halls, in the diaries they kept, and the letters they burned. And what was going to happen next? The mechanism by which that quiet asking began to have real consequences starts with something so basic, so fundamental that the Victorians have found an almost artful way to pretend it did not exist. It starts with the legal reality of what happened to a woman the moment she said yes, the moment she signed her name on a marriage certificate, and in doing so legally ceased to exist. That story is where we are headed next. And I promise you, it is stranger and darker, and in some ways more hopeful than you might expect. There is a legal term I want you to hold on to for the next few minutes. Coverture. It sounds almost elegant, does it not? Like something you might find on a dessert menu, or the name of fabric. Coverture. In French, it simply means covering or shelter. And that is exactly how it was framed when English common law adopted it centuries before the Victorian era as a form of protection. A husband covering his wife, sheltering her from the harsh legal world, taking on her burdens and her obligations as his own. The language was generous. The reality was something else entirely. Let me take you back to a specific moment, a specific woman, a specific story that once you hear it, I think you will find very difficult to forget. The year is 1827. A woman named Caroline Norton is 20 years old and has just married a man named George Norton. By the standards of the time, it is a reasonable match. George Norton is a barrister, later a member of Parliament from a respectable family. Caroline is witty, beautiful, socially brilliant, and already showing signs of real literary talent. Within a few years, the marriage has become a misery. George Norton is, by most accounts, a man of erratic temper and considerable jealousy. The accounts of what went on inside their home during those years are uncomfortable to read, even now. Caroline would later describe a marriage marked by regular cruelty, not metaphorical cruelty, but the physical kind. She described being struck, being thrown across a room, being left injured, and having nowhere to go and no one to tell who had any legal power to help her. Because here is what cover men in practice for Caroline Norton. She could not leave and take her children. The children were his legally. She had no claim to them whatsoever. She could not take her own earnings. Caroline was a successful writer. Her poems sold well. Her plays were performed in London. She made real money from her pen. But undercover, every penny of that income legally belonged to George Norton the moment it arrived. He could take it, and she had no recourse. She could not sue him. As a married woman, she had no legal standing to bring a case. She was not, in the eyes of the law, a person who could sue. She could not even leave and claim any kind of legal separation without his cooperation because the grounds required for divorce were so stringent and so deliberately stacked against wives that they functioned in practice as no option at all. Think about what that means. Truly think about it. This is a woman who is educated, talented, socially connected, earning her own income, and she is as legally trapped as if she'd been locked in a room with no key. George Norton eventually did something that even by Victorian standards was considered a low move. He accused Caroline of having an affair with the Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne. The accusation was almost certainly false. Historians have found no credible evidence to support it, and the jury in the resulting trial acquitted Melbourne completely after deliberating for barely an hour. But the damage to Caroline's reputation was done. In Victorian society, merely being accused was often sufficient, and George, understanding the system he was operating within, used the scandal to take the children away entirely and refuse Caroline any access to them. She did not see her sons for years. Her youngest child, William, fell from a pony when he was 8 years old and developed an infection in the wound. The injury worsened over several days. By the time George Norton informed Caroline, by the time she was permitted to go to her own child, William was dying. He died in her arms within a few hours of her arrival. She had not been there. She had not known. Her son had been sick for days, and nobody had told her because the law did not require them to. I'm going to say that again because I think it needs to sit for a moment. Her son was dying, and the law did not require anyone to tell her. What makes Caroline Norton remarkable is what she did next. Most women in her position would have had no path forward. The grief, the powerlessness, the sheer exhaustion of fighting a system designed at every level to defeat you. That is an enormous weight to carry, and most people would eventually set it down. Caroline Norton picked it up and started writing pamphlets. She wrote directly to members of Parliament. She published detailed, argued, legally specific documents laying out exactly what the law did to women like her. She wrote about the Custody of Infants Act, which had no provision for mothers at all. She wrote about the contradiction of a system that held women morally responsible for their children, while simultaneously declaring those children not legally theirs. Her writing was not hysterical. That is the thing that strikes you when you read it. It is measured and precise and devastatingly logical. She was making legal arguments in an era when women were not supposed to be capable of making legal arguments, and it worked. In 1839, largely as a result of Caroline Norton's campaign, Parliament passed the Custody of Infants Act. It was a limited victory. Mothers of what the law called unblemished character could now petition for custody of children under the age of 7, and only if the mother had not been convicted of adultery. The bar was almost insultingly low, but it was the first time in English legal history that a mother had any statutory right to her own children at all. Caroline Norton never fully benefited from the law she had fought for. Her own situation remained complicated for years afterward. She spent much of her adult life in a legal limbo, publicly recognized as a woman of talent and influence privately without the rights that recognition should have carried. She once wrote with a kind of quiet fury that I find completely understandable. I exist, and I suffer, and the law consigns me to silence. That sentence written in the 1850s about a system that was the law of the land. I exist, and I suffer, and the law consigns me to silence. Now I want to step back from Caroline's story for a moment and look at the broader architecture of what coverture actually did to ordinary Victorian women. Not the celebrated ones, not the ones with literary careers and parliamentary connections, but the ones whose names we do not know. Because the effects of cover were not just dramatic and obvious like losing custody of children. They were woven into the smallest transactions of daily life in ways that were constant and grinding and almost impossible to escape. Consider this. A married woman in Victorian England could not sign a lease on a house. If she needed to rent a room, she needed her husband's signature or her husband's permission to act on her behalf. If she had no husband, if she was widowed or separated, or if her husband had simply abandoned her, the practical complications multiplied enormously. She could not enter into a contract, which meant she could not hire workers, could not make formal business arrangements, could not even in many circumstances make purchases on credit without her husband's involvement. If someone owed her money, genuinely legally owed her money, she could not sue to collect it in her own name. Her husband would have to bring the suit. If he refused, or if he was absent, or if he was the one who owed her the money, she had essentially no remedy. And here's one that I think is particularly cruel in its specificity. If a husband abandoned his wife, entirely walked out and disappeared, never came back, took no responsibility for his family, he still legally controlled her property. She could not sell assets to feed her children without his signature, and she could not get his signature because he was gone. The law had in effect created a way for a man to both abandon his obligations and retain his power simultaneously. There is a question I get asked sometimes when I talk about this period, and I want to address it directly because I think it is genuinely worth sitting with. The question is, why did women accept this? And I understand why people ask it. From where we stand today, this system looks so obviously almost cartoonishly unjust that it seems impossible to imagine anyone tolerating it. And the implication behind the question is sometimes a subtle kind of blame. Why did they not simply refuse? The answer has several layers, and none of them are simple. The first layer is that many women did not fully know the details of what the law said about them until they needed to rely on it. The legal intricacies of coverture were not taught to girls. They were not explained at the altar. A woman might live her entire married life without ever needing to test the legal boundaries of her situation. If her husband was kind, if the marriage was stable, if she never found herself in a position of needing to act independently, the cage was only fully visible when you try to walk out of it. The second layer is that refusal was not actually a meaningful option for most women. In practical terms, to refuse to marry was to choose a life of severe social marginalization, and for most women, genuine financial precarity. A middle-class woman who remained unmarried was dependent on her father, then on her brothers, then on the charity of relatives. She had almost no path to financial independence. The few respectable options available to her governor school teacher. Eventually, clerical work later in the century paid so little that true independence was barely achievable. And the third layer is the one I think is most important and most often overlooked. Women were not passive objects who had things done to them. Within the constraints of the system, they exercised real intelligence, real agency, real power, often in ways the system did not formally recognize. They built networks. They kept meticulous accounts that their husbands depended on. They negotiated the social landscape of their communities with the sophistication that shaped the opportunities available to their entire families. The tragedy is not that Victorian women were powerless. The tragedy is that so much of their power was deliberately made invisible, deliberately kept informal, deliberately excluded from the legal and economic structures that would have given it real protection. Let me tell you about a different kind of woman to show you another face of this same story. Her name was Harriet Martineau. She was born in 1802 in Norwich into a moderately prosperous family. She was one of 8 children, suffered significant hearing loss from early childhood, and by her mid-20s had been left with very little money after her family's financial situation deteriorated sharply. She had no choice but to work. Martineau became a writer, not a hobbyist, not a contributor of occasional pieces, a professional full-time, commercially serious writer. She wrote economics. She wrote political theory. She wrote about taxation and free trade and labor and social policy in a period when those were not topics women were supposed to understand, let alone explain to the general public. And she was extraordinarily good at it. Her series, Illustrations of Political Economy, published through the 1830s, was enormously popular. Prime ministers read it. Parliament discussed it. She was invited to dinner by presidents and intellectuals and reformers across 2 continents. She traveled to America and wrote one of the most perceptive accounts of American society published in the 19th century. She was by every external measure one of the most influential public intellectuals of her age. She also never married, not because no one was interested. There were proposals. She turned them down, or circumstances prevented the marriages from happening. And eventually Martineau made the decision explicitly and publicly. She preferred independence. In a letter she wrote later in life, she described what it felt like to live as an unmarried woman with her own income in her own household. And the word she used most was free. Not happy, though she also said she was happy. Free. The ability to work on what she chose to go, where she wanted to manage her own affairs, to organize her days around her own purposes rather than someone else's. She understood with absolute clarity that what she had was the exception, that for most women, that freedom was not available. And she spent a significant part of her career writing about exactly why that was and exactly what needed to change. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 was the first real legal crack in the structure of cover. Under its provisions, a married woman could keep her own wages and any money she inherited, rather than having it automatically transfer to her husband. This sounds so basic as to be almost embarrassing. She could keep her own wages, but it was genuinely revolutionary in the context of the existing law. Then in 1882, a more comprehensive act extended those protections to all property, not just earnings. A woman could now, for the first time in English legal history, own and control property in her own name throughout her marriage. These were real victories. They were hard-fought and hard-won, and the women who campaigned for them deserve to be remembered. But I want to be careful not to present them as the end of the story, because they were not. The acts changed property law. They did not change the culture, the medicine, the social expectations, or the dozens of other mechanisms by which Victorian society kept women in their place. And there is one detail about the 1882 Act that I think is particularly telling. When the Married Women's Property Bills were debated in Parliament, a significant portion of the debate was not actually about whether women deserved equal rights. It was about whether giving women property rights would cause arguments in the home. I want to read that back to you. The concern, as recorded in parliamentary debates, was that if wives had their own property, it would lead to disputes between husbands and wives, and disputes would undermine the harmony of the household, and a harmonious household was the cornerstone of society. Therefore, perhaps women should not have rights, because rights might cause arguments. The logic, once you lay it out plainly, is almost dizzying. It is not even pretending to be about justice. It is openly, explicitly about keeping women compliant in order to preserve a particular kind of domestic peace. And the question I keep returning to is peace for whom? What cover did at its deepest level was not just strip women of legal rights. It stripped them of legal personhood. And there's a difference between those two things that I think matters enormously. Rights can be granted incrementally, adjusted, expanded, but personhood is foundational. It is the thing underneath all the rights, the basic recognition that you are a subject with interests and a perspective, not an object to be managed and accounted for. When Victorian law said that a married woman's identity was suspended, absorbed into her husband's, it was not just making a statement about property and contracts. It was making a statement about what kind of being a woman was. And that statement, that foundational bedrock statement, took far longer than any single act of Parliament to fully dismantle. In some ways, the argument could be made that we are still dismantling it. But that is a conversation for a later part of tonight's story, because right now I want to take you somewhere a little more intimate, away from the courtrooms and the parliamentary debates, and into the actual physical space of the Victorian home, into the kitchens and the parlors and the bedrooms and the nurseries. Because the law was one cage, the body was another. And what Victorian society did to women's physical lives, the way it shaped and constrained and quite literally corseted the female body into a particular form, is a story that is simultaneously stranger, more painful, and more darkly fascinating than almost anything else we have covered tonight. That is where we are going next. All right, let us go inside. Not into the grand parlors and drawing rooms you've seen in period dramas, though we will get there. Let us start somewhere more fundamental than that. Let us start with the body itself. Because before we can understand what the Victorian home did to women emotionally and legally and socially, we need to understand what it did to them physically. And I mean that quite literally. The Victorian era had opinions about the female body that were so specific, so elaborate, and in many cases so medically bizarre that when you first encounter them, you genuinely cannot tell if you are reading history or satire. You are reading history. I checked. Picture a Wednesday morning in 1865. A middle-class Victorian woman wakes up. Before she does anything else, before breakfast, before she speaks to her children, before she has her tea, she is dressed. And dressing for a Victorian woman was not a casual affair. It began with a corset. Now, corsets have had a bit of a cultural rehabilitation lately. There is a whole conversation happening in certain corners of the internet about how they were not actually that bad, how the horror stories were exaggerated, how women chose to wear them and found them comfortable and supportive. And there is some truth in that conversation, to be fair. The very tightest forms of corseting, what was called tight lacing, were practiced by a minority of women, not the majority. Most Victorian women wore moderately fitted corsets that by the standards of the time were considered perfectly normal undergarments. But I want to be precise about what even moderate Victorian corseting actually involved, because the goal of the corset was not support in the modern sense. The goal was to produce a specific silhouette, a silhouette defined by a dramatically compressed waist relative to the hips and chest. The fashionable waist measurement for a middle-class Victorian woman in the 1860s and 1870s was somewhere between 18 and 22 inches. A natural adult waist, depending on the individual, tends to run considerably larger. Doctors of the period documented the physical consequences of long-term corseting with considerable detail. Compressed ribs, displaced organs, difficulty breathing deeply. Women who had worn corsets since adolescence, and many had, because girls were put into stays from a young age, sometimes had ribs that had visibly altered shape over the years. One physician, writing in 1887, noted that he could identify women who'd been tightly corseted throughout their teens by examining their skeletal structure alone. And yet the corset persisted through decade after decade of medical criticism because the silhouette it produced was not merely a fashion preference. It was a social signal. It communicated class, respectability, femininity, and self-control. A woman who did not wear a corset was not just unfashionable. She was morally suspicious. She was letting herself go, which in Victorian terms meant she was failing at the fundamental project of being a proper woman. The external shape of the body was, in other words, a performance of internal virtue. In that equation, the idea that a woman's physical appearance was a direct reflection of her moral character ran much deeper than corsets. Let's talk about a medical diagnosis that was for a period in the late Victorian era. Genuinely one of the most commonly cited conditions in women's medical records. It was called hysteria. The word comes from the Greek word for uterus, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously it was taken as a scientific concept. The basic idea, which had been circulating in medical thinking since ancient times, was that certain emotional and behavioral disturbances in women were rooted in their reproductive biology. Women were, by their nature, more susceptible to nervous disorders. Their bodies made them emotionally volatile. Their physiology made them prone to irrationality. In the Victorian era, this ancient prejudice got dressed up in the language of modern medicine, and the result was a diagnostic category, so broad it could encompass almost anything. A woman who was sad could have hysteria. A woman who was angry could have hysteria. A woman who was anxious or excitable or easily fatigued or emotionally flat, or who cried too much, or who did not cry enough, or who had physical symptoms that her doctor could not otherwise explain. All of these could be and were diagnosed as hysteria. The treatment options were varied, to put it diplomatically. Rest was the most common recommendation. Extended compulsory rest, Women with hysteria were often prescribed the so-called rest cure, a regimen developed in the 1870s by an American physician named Silas Weir Mitchell. The rest cure involved weeks or months of complete bed rest isolation from family and friends, prohibition of reading and writing and intellectual activity of any kind, and a diet designed to increase body weight. The theory was that women with nervous disorders had depleted their limited reserves of vital energy through excessive mental or emotional activity, and that complete physical and mental passivity was required to restore them. Women who had been lively, intellectually active, socially engaged people were put to bed and told to lie there alone with nothing to do for months. If that sounds to you less like a cure and more like the thing that would make a thinking person genuinely unwell, you're not wrong. And several women who underwent the rescue said exactly that. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was an American writer who underwent the rescue in 1887 after experiencing what her doctor diagnosed as a severe nervous disorder following the birth of her daughter. The doctor was, as it happened, Silas Mitchell himself. His instructions, as Gilman later recorded them, were precise. She was to live as domestic a life as possible, to have her child with her at all times, to lie down an hour after every meal, to do no more than 2 hours of intellectual work per day, and critically never to touch pen brush or pencil again for as long as she lived. She followed these instructions, and she later wrote that she came in 3 months very near to losing her mind entirely. She described crawling into closets and hiding. She described sitting on the floor and howling. She described a mental state she characterized as the closest thing to absolute failure of all that makes a human being that she could conceive of. Eventually defying the doctor's orders, she began to write again. The symptoms eased, and out of that experience a few years later, she wrote a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, a first-person account of a woman driven to break down by exactly the rescuer she had endured. The story is considered one of the most significant pieces of American fiction of the 19th century. It is short, maybe 30 pages, and it is even now one of the most psychologically precise and genuinely disturbing things I have ever read, because it understands from the inside what it feels like to be a thinking person whose thoughts have been declared dangerous to herself. Gilman later wrote that she sent a copy of The Yellow Wallpaper to Silas Weir Mitchell directly. She said she never heard whether it changed his practice, but she was told by friends that he had altered his treatment of nervous disorders in women after reading it. That is either gratifying or infuriating, depending on your mood, possibly both. Now, here's where I want to make a distinction that I think matters, and that gets lost sometimes in these conversations. Not every Victorian doctor was callous. Not every medical professional of the era was deliberately dismissing women's experiences or weaponizing medicine as a tool of social control. Some of them were genuinely trying to help patients they did not understand using the frameworks available to them. And those frameworks were deeply and structurally flawed in ways that were very difficult to see from inside the era. The problem was not individual cruelty. The problem was systemic assumption. The assumption that women's emotional and psychological experiences were inherently linked to their reproductive biology. The assumption that intellectual ambition or professional desire was somehow unnatural in women, and therefore a potential symptom of disorder. The assumption that the appropriate response to a woman's distress was to reduce her circumstances further, to simplify, to confine, to quiet rather than to expand, to engage, to take seriously what she was actually saying about her own experience. Those assumptions were not random. They were structural. They came from the same place as cover as the angel in the house, as the separate spheres ideology. They were all expressions of the same foundational idea that women were a fundamentally different category of human being with different needs and different capacities, and that the appropriate response to that difference was constraint. There is a condition that was extremely common among Victorian women, particularly among young women in the middle and upper classes that historians and medical researchers have spent considerable time analyzing. It was called chlorosis, sometimes called the green sickness or the virgin's disease. It was characterized by palate fatigue weakness, difficulty breathing, heart palpitations, and what contemporaries described as a greenish tinge to the complexion. It affected young women in disproportionate numbers, and it was treated with everything from iron supplements to marriage. The latter being recommended on the theory that the condition was caused by sexual frustration or the suppression of natural biological functions. Modern researchers looking back at the symptoms have a more straightforward explanation. Chlorosis was almost certainly iron deficiency anemia, and the reason it disproportionately affected young middle and upper-class women is not mysterious once you understand how those households actually worked. Women in middle-class Victorian families were typically given smaller portions of meat than the men in the household. The best cuts went to the husband and the older boys. Women and girls received what remained. This was considered entirely normal. Men needed more sustenance because they were engaged in active demanding work, while women who were sedentary and domestic required less. Meanwhile, those same young women were wearing garments that compressed their abdomen and restricted their breathing, limiting their physical activity and their capacity for exercise. They were being educated in accomplishments, music, drawing, needlework, rather than in subjects that would engage them physically or intellectually. They were living in many cases genuinely sedentary lives with restricted nutrition. The result was a condition that affected thousands of women, was treated as a mysterious medical puzzle, and was sometimes blamed on the women themselves on excessive reading or insufficient piety or a failure to embrace their domestic nature wholeheartedly enough. The women were anemic. They were being underfed, and the medical response was sometimes to recommend that they do less. Let me ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this rather than just moving past it. If you were told from childhood that your natural constitution was delicate, that your biology made you more susceptible to illness and emotional distress, that intellectual exertion was potentially dangerous for you, that your body required protection and management rather than development and challenge, how would that shape your sense of what you were capable of? Because that is what Victorian girls were taught, not always explicitly. Sometimes through the specific things they were not permitted to do. Sometimes through the way adults reacted when they showed intellectual ambition or physical boldness, with concern rather than encouragement, with worry rather than pride. Girls in middle-class families were not typically permitted to run, literally run. It was considered unladylike and physically inadvisable. They were not encouraged to engage in strenuous physical activity. They were often kept indoors in cold weather and poorly ventilated rooms, because the outside air was considered potentially harmful to their fragile constitutions. Compare that with their brothers who might be sent to boarding schools with rigorous physical programs, who played sports, who were actively encouraged to develop physical confidence and stamina, because those qualities were considered masculine virtues. And then tell me, after 20 years of being treated as physically fragile, intellectually at risk, constitutionally unsuited to the rigors of the public world, would you feel confident stepping out into that world? Would you feel entitled to it? The medical ideology of the Victorian era was doing in the realm of the body exactly what the legal ideology was doing in the realm of property and personhood. It was building a cage out of the assumption that the cage was for your own good. There is one more medical story I want to tell you because I think it illuminates something important about how power works when it gets dressed up in professional language. In the second half of the 19th century, a diagnosis began appearing more frequently in medical literature. It was applied to women who refused to eat adequately, women who were described as willfully restricting their food intake to the point of dangerous thinness. The Victorian physician William W.I.G., who was treating patients at Guy's Hospital in London in the 1870s, was among the first to describe and name this condition systematically. He called it anorexia nervosa, and his clinical descriptions of his patients are remarkably detailed and in places genuinely compassionate. But what the medical literature of the period almost entirely failed to grapple with was the question of why. Not the physiological mechanics of the condition, but the social and psychological context from which it was emerging. We cannot, across a century and a half of distance, make definitive claims about the interior lives of individual patients. But historians studying this period have observed something worth noting. The women most likely to develop these patterns of restricted eating were often young middle-class women who lived in exactly the kind of tightly controlled, highly supervised domestic environments we've been describing. Women who had very little control over almost any aspect of their lives, their education, their marriages, their daily schedules, their futures. The body, in the absence of any other domain of agency, became a site where something like control could be exercised. Even if that control was self-destructive, even if it was the only form of refusal available, I am not reducing a complex medical condition to a single social explanation. but I do think there is something in that pattern worth sitting with. When people have very little power over their own lives, they tend to find ways to exercise whatever power remains available to them. And sometimes the only thing that remains is the body. The Victorian home was a physical environment as much as a social and legal one. And that physical environment was shaped at every level by ideas about what women's bodies were, what they needed, and what they were for. The parlor was designed for receiving visitors and performing respectable femininity. The kitchen was designed for labor, but in middle-class households, the lady of the house was not supposed to be physically present in it. That was the cook's domain. The bedroom was private, but not entirely her own. The nursery was her responsibility, but managed by a nurse. The garden was a permitted outdoor space, but walking in it at certain hours in certain weather required justification. It was in every sense a managed environment. A woman navigating a Victorian middle-class home was navigating a space that had been designed around a specific theory of what she was, and every room reflected that theory back at her. She cannot escape it by going outside, because outside the home the theory intensified rather than relaxed. In the street, in the shops, in any public space, she was subject to scrutiny and judgment that evaluated her against the same ideal she could never quite reach. She could not escape it in her own mind entirely, because the theory had been installed there too by her education and her reading and her mother and her church and every cultural message she had received since childhood. And yet within all of that constraint, within all of that managed and corseted and medically surveilled existence, something was stirring. Something that the ideology had not fully accounted for. Because you can control what a woman owns. You can control what she wears. You can control where she goes and what she reads and how she spends her days. But you cannot, it turns out, fully control what she thinks about any of it. And what Victorian women were thinking behind the careful performances and the obligatory smiles and the meticulous household management was the question of what we are going to explore next. Because we have talked about the body and the law. We have talked about the ideal and the reality. Now it is time to talk about something that was in many ways the original architecture of all of it. The moment a woman signed her name and her future away in the same breath. The Victorian marriage itself, what it actually was, what it actually meant, and the extraordinary stories of the women who navigated it. Some with grace, some with strategy, and some with a quiet, determined ferocity that the era then never quite saw coming. Something I want you to imagine for a moment. You are 19 years old. It is 1858. You're sitting in a drawing room in London, wearing something that weighs approximately 15 pounds and requires assistance to put on. Across the room, a man you have met perhaps 4 or 5 times in carefully supervised social settings is making conversation with your father. Your mother catches your eye from the other side of the room and gives you a look that contains an entire instruction manual in a single glance. This man, whose opinions on most subjects you have never been permitted to discover, whose temperament you've had no real opportunity to assess, whose habits and debts and private character are largely unknown to you. This man may within the next few weeks make an offer. And the question your family is quietly, urgently asking is not whether you love him. The question is whether he is solvent. That is the Victorian marriage market. And it was a market in the most literal sense of the word. Let me give you some numbers, because I think the economics of Victorian marriage are genuinely underdized when people talk about this period. And without understanding the economics, you cannot fully understand the choices or the absence of choices that women were navigating. A middle-class Victorian family in the 1850s and 1860s might have an annual income of somewhere between $300 and $800 a year, depending on the father's profession. Out of that income, they were expected to maintain a household, employ at least 1 or 2 servants, dress respectably, and crucially provide their daughters with a dowry sufficient to attract a suitable husband. A daughter without a dowry was a serious liability. A daughter with a generous dowry was an asset. This was not a sentiment people were shy about. It appeared in letters, in diaries, in legal correspondence, in financial planning documents. Fathers calculated their daughters' marriage prospects with the same directness they applied to any other financial investment. The woman herself in this calculation was simultaneously the product being sold and the person doing the selling. She was expected to present herself attractively, behave correctly, display the right accomplishments, and secure the best possible match while pretending at every stage that none of this was happening. The entire performance had to look effortless and romantic, and entirely free of commercial motivation. It was one of the more demanding double standards in a period that had quite a few. The season deserves its own moment here, because it was the mechanism through which the marriage market actually operated for upper middle and upper class families. The London season ran roughly from May through July each year, and it was organized around a series of social events, balls, dinners, garden parties, opera evenings, presentations at court that functioned in practice as an extended, elaborate, and extremely expensive marriage exhibition. Families with eligible daughters came to London for the season specifically to arrange introductions and facilitate matches. The cost of participating was substantial. A suitable wardrobe for a daughter being presented for the first time could run to hundreds of pounds. The rent for a suitable London house for 3 months, the entertaining, the carriages, the social subscriptions. All of this represented a significant financial outlay that many families stretched themselves considerably to afford. And the entire apparatus was justified by a single goal: getting the daughter married. Preferably well, ideally quickly before the investment had to be repeated the following year. A young woman who went through multiple seasons without securing a proposal was described as a failure in a way that was not metaphorical. She had failed at the central task her family and society had assigned her. The language used about such women was not cruel exactly, but it was relentless. She was on the shelf. She was left behind. She was a spinster in waiting. After 25 or so, she was simply a spinster. And the social meaning of that word in Victorian England was not merely that she had not married. It meant she had missed her fundamental purpose. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about this, and what I think complicates the easy story. Some women chose it deliberately, strategically, with their eyes open. Not many. The social and financial pressures against remaining unmarried were immense, as we have established. But there was a small and interesting population of Victorian women who looked at the marriage market, understood exactly what it was offering, calculated the cost, and declined. The writer Mary Kellenly in the 1890s described the experience of receiving a proposal from a man she found perfectly agreeable, but entirely unsuitable for her actual life. She wrote about sitting in the garden after he'd left, and feeling, she said, as if she had just narrowly escaped something she could not quite name. What she had narrowly escaped, I think, was the exchange, the fundamental transaction at the heart of Victorian marriage, which was this. A woman exchanged her independence, her legal personhood, her property, and in many respects, her future choices for financial security and social legitimacy. And a man exchanged financial resources and social status for a domestic manager, a social ornament, and an heir-producing partner. That sounds stark. It is meant to, because underneath all the romance, and there was genuine romance in Victorian marriages, I did not want to flatten that underneath. It was this structural reality that both parties understood and that shaped every interaction. Let me tell you about a woman who navigated this transaction with a clarity that still reads as remarkable. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. You may know her better as Mary Shelley, the woman who wrote Frankenstein at the age of 18. But the part of her story I want to focus on tonight is not the famous novel. It is what her life looked like before and after the fame. Mary was the daughter of two radical intellectual figures. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who had written A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792, one of the foundational texts of feminist thought. Her father was William Godwin, a philosopher and anarchist thinker. She was raised in an intellectually extraordinary household that had unconventional opinions about marriage property and social convention. At 16, she fell in love with Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was inconveniently already married. She ran away with him to Europe, taking her stepsister with them in what was, by any Victorian standard, an act of spectacular social recklessness. They lived in poverty for years. Their first child, born prematurely, died within days. Mary recorded in her journal simply that she dreamed her baby was not dead, that she rubbed it in front of the fire and it came back to life. That is one of the most heartbreaking sentences I have ever encountered in a private document. Just that, the dream, the fire, the hope. Percy eventually married her after his first wife's death. Mary became Mary Shelley. And the life she lived after that, after his death in 1822, when she was 24 years old, was the life of a woman navigating Victorian society alone with a young son, a limited income, a complicated reputation, and a level of intellectual ability that the world around her was not fully equipped to accommodate. She wrote, she edited Percy's work, she published, she turned down offers of remarriage, including some from men who could have provided substantial financial security, because she did not want to lose the independence limited financially precarious, but real that widowhood had paradoxically given her. She lived to be 53. She raised her son. She kept writing. What strikes me most about Mary Shell is not the famous novel, brilliant as it is. It is the 40-odd years of quiet, determined, imperfect navigation of an impossible situation. The refusing to be entirely defined by any of the roles the world tried to assign her. Not the scandalous young runaway, not the great poet's wife, not the tragic widow, not the respectable remarried matron, just herself working on her own terms as much as the world permitted. Now, let's talk about the other end of the spectrum, because not everyone had Mary Shell's stubbornness or her particular advantages or her willingness to absorb the social consequences of an unconventional life. Most Victorian women entered marriage with a combination of genuine hope and genuine resignation. And inside those marriages, they built lives that were often far more interesting and far more complicated than the angel in the house ideal suggested. The management of a Victorian household, particularly in the expanding middle class, was genuinely complex work. By the 1860s, a middle-class family might employ anywhere from 2 to 6 domestic servants, depending on their income level. A cook, a housemaid, a parlor maid, possibly a lady's maid for the mistress, a nursemaid for the children, and a general servant or two. The mistress of the house was responsible for managing all of them. That meant hiring, supervising, dismissing when necessary, managing wages and references, and the incredibly complex social hierarchies that existed within the servant community itself. It meant planning menus, managing household accounts, negotiating with tradespeople, monitoring the quality of supplies. It meant scheduling the family social calendar, maintaining correspondence, keeping track of social obligations, and reciprocating them correctly. Isabella Beeton, whose famous book on household management we touched on in our outline earlier, but whose actual story I want to give proper space to now describe the mistress of the household as comparable in her responsibilities to the commander of an army or the manager of a great commercial enterprise. She wrote that her role required constant attention, consistent judgment, and the ability to make decisions under pressure while maintaining a demeanor of effortless calm. She was not wrong. It was genuinely demanding work. And yet, and this is the thing that strikes me every time I think about it, none of this work appeared in any economic statistic. None of it was counted as labor. None of it earned wages. None of it gave the woman who performed it any independent financial standing. It was simply what she was supposed to do because she was a wife. I want to stop here and ask you something honestly. When you picture a Victorian marriage, what do you see? Be real about it for a second. I think most of us, if we are honest, picture something from a period drama, a candle-lit dining room, a husband and wife in formal clothing, perhaps slightly distant, perhaps affectionate, in a restrained and dignified way, maybe a garden scene, maybe a morning room with letters and tea. What we do not picture, what the visual culture of the period almost never showed, was the actual texture of intimacy inside those marriages. The negotiations and the silences and the small daily frictions. The things that were never said because there was no framework for saying them. The disappointments that had nowhere to go. A Victorian wife had very limited formal recourse when a marriage was unhappy. We discussed the legal dimensions of this in the context of cover, but I want to look at the emotional and practical dimensions now, because they were in many ways even more restrictive. She could not in most cases leave. If she left without legal grounds, which required proving cruelty or adultery, and meeting an extremely high evidentiary standard, she forfeited any claim to financial support. And, as we discussed her children, she could not in many social circles even speak openly about an unhappy marriage. To criticize her husband publicly was considered a profound breach of wheelie duty, a betrayal of the domestic sanctuary, and potentially evidence that the fault lay with her rather than with him. She was expected to manage her unhappiness privately the way she managed everything else quietly and visibly without inconveniencing anyone. There is a woman named Effie Gray whose story, I think, deserves to be much more widely known than it is. Effie Gray married the art critic John Ruskin in 1848 when she was 19 years old. Ruskin was one of the most celebrated intellectuals in England, a man whose opinions on art and architecture and society shaped the aesthetic taste of an entire generation. The marriage from almost the beginning was deeply wrong. The specifics of exactly what happened between them have been debated by historians for more than a century and a half, and I do not want to reduce the complexity. But what is documented is this. After 6 years of marriage, Effie Gray applied for an annulment on the grounds that the marriage had never been consummated. The annulment was granted. The marriage was dissolved. Now, in Victorian terms, that process required Effie Gray to make profoundly private information about her marriage public before a legal tribunal in a way that exposed her to social judgment and potential humiliation regardless of the outcome. She had to prove in legal terms something deeply personal about her own intimate life. She did it anyway, and the aftermath was fascinating. There was a period of intense public scrutiny and some social ostracism. But Effie Gray was also a young woman with considerable social intelligence and genuine courage. Within the year, she had married the painter John Everett Mill. By most accounts, that second marriage was genuinely happy. She and Millay had 8 children together and remained close until his death. She outlived him, and she outlived Ruskin, and she lived long enough to see her story become public in ways that I think surprised everyone involved. What strikes me about Effie Gray is that she did something most Victorian women in her position would not have dared to do. She decided that the cost of staying was higher than the cost of leaving, and then she absorbed those costs and rebuilt. That is not a small thing. In the context of Victorian marriage, that is an act of considerable courage. The divorce statistics for the Victorian era tell an interesting story on their own. Before the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, divorces in England could only be obtained through a special act of Parliament, a process so expensive and so procedurally complex that it was effectively available only to the very wealthy, and even then extremely rare. In the entire period between 1700 and 1857, fewer than 400 divorce cases were brought to Parliament. After the 1857 Act created a proper civil divorce court, the numbers began to rise, but the grounds remained profoundly unequal. A husband could divorce his wife on the grounds of her adultery alone. A wife to divorce her husband had to prove adultery combined with at least one additional aggravating factor: cruelty, desertion for 2 years, or more, incest, or other specific offenses. Put simply, a wife who was unfaithful gave her husband automatic grounds for divorce. A husband who was unfaithful gave his wife nothing legally, unless he was also cruel or had abandoned her. The logic behind this inequality was stated openly in parliamentary debates. A wife's infidelity was considered a more serious offense because it potentially introduced illegitimate children into the husband's lineage, which threatened the orderly transfer of property through inheritance. A husband's infidelity was considered a personal failing, but not a structural threat to the family unit. In other words, the law was protecting property, as usual. What I keep returning to thinking about Victorian marriages is the question of what happened to love inside those structures. Because it was not absent. That would be too simple. There were genuinely devoted Victorian marriages, genuinely tender partnerships, genuine intellectual companionships between husbands and wives who respected and admired each other. But love inside those structures was always operating alongside something else. It was always negotiating with economics, with law, with social expectation, with the fundamental power imbalance built into the institution itself. And for women, love was always a little bit of a gamble in a way that it was not for men. Because a woman who loved her husband and trusted him was in some sense placing all her bets on his character. She was betting that his kindness and his decency would outperform the legal and social structures that gave him near total authority over her life. Most of the time, that bet was not catastrophic. Many Victorian husbands were decent men who did not exploit the powers the law gave them. But the power was there, and the knowledge that it was there, the awareness, however, submerged that her entire life rested on the continued goodwill of one person. That knowledge lived somewhere in every Victorian woman's experience of marriage. Not necessarily consciously, not necessarily in a way she could have articulated, but present. The way the weight of a ceiling is always present, even when you're not thinking about it. The Victorian marriage was a profound and complicated institution. It was a site of genuine love and genuine cruelty and profound boredom and extraordinary resilience and everything in between. It was not one thing, but the structures surrounding it, the legal structures, the economic structures, the social expectations. Those were remarkably consistent. And what they consistently did was ensure that whatever happened inside a marriage, the woman had the fewest options and bore the greatest risk. That asymmetry is the thing I want you to carry with you as we move forward tonight. Because what we've been building across these sections is a picture of a world in which every major institution, the law, medicine, the cultural ideal, the marriage market, all pointed in the same direction. All said the same thing in different languages. That a woman's life was defined by the domestic space. That her value was relational rather than individual. That her needs came after everyone else's always. And yet there is another story running parallel to all of this. A story that is quieter, harder to see in the official record, but no less real. It is the story of the house itself, not the house as an ideal or a symbol or a legal category. The actual house, the kitchen and the scullery, and the servants' quarters and the narrow back staircase. Because that house contained another world, entirely a world stratified by class in ways that cut differently through women's lives depending on where they stood in the hierarchy. And the women at the bottom of that household hierarchy, the ones who cooked and cleaned and scrubbed and worked from before dawn until long after everyone else was in bed, their story is one we have barely touched on yet. That is where we're going next. Into the hidden working life of the Victorian house. Into the lives of the women who made the whole beautiful domestic performance possible and who received almost nothing in return. Walk with me to the back of the house. Not the front parlor with its carefully arranged furniture and its aspidistra plant in the window. Not the dining room where the family gathered for their formal meals. Walk past all of that through the green baize door that separated the family's world from the working world, down the narrow staircase, and into the space where the actual business of the Victorian home was conducted. The kitchen, the scullery, the servants' hall, the coal cellar, the laundry room. This is the part of the Victorian house that almost never appears in the paintings. And the women who lived and worked in it, who built their entire existences in that below-stairs world, are the women whose story we've barely begun to tell. Let me give you a number that I think genuinely stops people when they hear it. In 1891, according to the census of England and Wales, domestic service was the single largest category of female employment in the entire country. Not factory work, not agricultural labor, domestic service. Approximately 1.5 million women and girls in England and Wales were employed as domestic servants at the time of that census. 1.5 million. To put that in context, in a country with a total population of around 26 million, you had 112 million women working inside other people's homes. By 1911, that number had grown further with roughly 28% of all employed women in England and Wales engaged in some form of domestic service. This was not a marginal phenomenon. This was the defining female work experience of the Victorian era. And yet it occupies in most popular accounts of the period something like a footnote, a backdrop. The women who made the tea and carried the coals and scrubbed the doorsteps are somehow always behind the story rather than in it. Tonight they are in it. Who were these women? The vast majority came from working-class families, often from rural areas. The industrial transformation of Victorian England had disrupted traditional rural economies, and for many families, sending a daughter into domestic service was not a choice made from aspiration, but from necessity. It was one of the few options available that provided not just wages, but also room and board, which meant one less mouth to feed at home. Girls entered service young, genuinely young. A girl working as a scullery maid or a general servant in a modest household might be 13 or 14 years old. Some are younger. The 1851 census records girls as young as 10 listed as domestic servants, though this became less common as the century progressed and some limited protections for child labor gradually took effect. Think about that for a moment. A girl of 13 leaving her family going to live in a stranger's house, working under the authority of a mistress she had just met in a hierarchy. She had to learn quickly and navigate carefully in a job where her continued employment depended entirely on the goodwill and judgment of the people above her. That is not a background detail. That is somebody's entire adolescence, the daily schedule of a Victorian housemaid. And I want to walk through this in some detail because I think the specifics matter in a way that a general description does not capture. Typically began around 6 o'clock in the morning, sometimes earlier, before the family woke, before anyone in the upstairs world stirred. The servants were already at work. The fires had to be laid and lit in the drawing room, the dining room, the morning room, the study, the bedrooms, if the household was prosperous enough to heat them all. Laying a coal fire in a Victorian grate was not a simple task. The grate had to be cleaned out from the previous day, the ash removed, fresh coal, and kindling arranged correctly. The fire lit and then tended until it was properly established. Then the floors, sweeping the carpets with a brush because vacuum cleaners did not exist in the early Victorian era. Dusting every surface in every room. Polishing the furniture, cleaning the windows, blacking the kitchen range, which was a specific and particularly unpleasant task that involved applying a substance called black lead to the iron surface of the stove and then polishing it to a shiner process that left hands and clothing deeply stained and required considerable physical effort. All of this happened before breakfast, before the family came downstairs. And then the day continued, carrying hot water upstairs for the families. Morning washing in a period before indoor plumbing was standard in most homes. Clearing and laying the table for breakfast. Serving breakfast. Clearing it away. Beginning preparations for lunch. Answering the door. Maintaining the rooms. Preparing and serving tea. Preparing and serving dinner. Clearing dinner. Laying fires for the evening. Preparing bedrooms. Carrying hot water for evening washing. The working day of a housemaid in a Victorian household typically ended somewhere between 9 and 11 at night, sometimes later if there was entertaining. That is a working day of 15 to 17 hours in someone else's house for wages that in the mid-Victorian period range from roughly 8 to 4 per year for a housemaid, which sounds like an incomprehensible number until you remember that room and board were included. So the actual value was somewhat higher, but the cash in hand was genuinely very little. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. We have spent several parts of this story talking about the constraints on middle-class Victorian women, the legal limitations, the domestic ideology, the medical frameworks, the marriage market. And those constraints were real and significant. But what happens when you place those constraints alongside the experience of the housemaid who laid the middle-class woman's fires at 6 in the morning? Because here is the uncomfortable truth about the Victorian domestic ideal. It was in a very direct way dependent on a class of women whose lives were far more constrained than the mistress they served. The middle-class woman's freedom from physical household labor, the freedom that allowed her to read, to play the piano, to receive callers, to embody the angel in the house was purchased at the cost of another woman's entire waking life. The ideology of the domestic sphere praised women for their domestic role, while simultaneously ensuring that actual domestic work was performed by women who received no praise for it whatsoever. The work was only invisible when it was done by servants. The moment a middle-class woman was seen doing it herself, it became demeaning. That contradiction, domestic work, is sacred and feminine when it defines an ideal, but low and degrading when it is actually performed, is one of the most revealing fault lines in Victorian culture. And it ran directly through the relationship between mistress and servant. That relationship deserves its own examination because it was not simple. The Victorian mistress and her servants were both women, both subject in their different ways to the constraints we've been discussing throughout this story. And yet they occupied radically different positions within the same household with very different kinds of power and very different kinds of vulnerability. The mistress had legal and social authority over her servants. She could hire and dismiss them. She could provide or withhold the character reference, the letter of recommendation, without which a dismissed servant would struggle to find new employment. The character reference was enormously important in Victorian domestic service. A servant dismissed without a reference or with a negative one might find herself effectively unemployable in respectable households. That power was real, and it was sometimes misused. There are documented cases in diaries, in court records, in social reform literature of servants dismissed without reference for offenses that seem by any reasonable standard trivial, of servants accused of theft without evidence, of servants given references that describe their work with a deliberate ambiguity, designed to raise doubts without stating anything actionable. But the servant also had information, and information in the Victorian household was a form of power that the ideology refused to acknowledge, but that everyone understood perfectly well. A lady's maid, who dressed her mistress every morning, knew things about that woman's body and health and marriage, and private correspondence that almost no one else knew. A cook, who'd been with a family for 20 years, had witnessed versions of that family's life. That would never appear in any public record. Servants were present at the moments a household most wanted invisible. The arguments, the illnesses, the financial crises, the visits from people who were not supposed to be there. The discretion of a trusted servant was in practice worth considerable amounts to the families who employed them, and the best servants understood this perfectly. The relationship between a long-serving trusted servant and her employer was sometimes characterized by a kind of mutual dependence that the official hierarchy of the household was not designed to acknowledge. Let me tell you about a woman named Hannah Colwick. Hannah Colwick was born in 1833 in Shropshire, the daughter of Sadler. She went into service at the age of 8 years old, and spent the next several decades working as a maidservant and later a cook general in various households across England. She's not famous for her service. She's famous because of the extraordinary record she left behind. From 1854 onward, Hannah Colwick kept a diary. Not the polished, carefully composed diary of a woman writing for posterity, but a genuine working journal detailed, specific, unglamorous, written in her own particular voice. She recorded what she did each day, hour by hour, in a level of detail that is almost unprecedented for a working-class woman of the period. She wrote about the fire she laid, and the boots she cleaned, and the meals she prepared, and the physical exhaustion of the work, and the petty difficulties with other servants, and the moments of unexpected satisfaction. She also wrote with considerable frankness about the class dynamics of her world, about what it felt like to be simultaneously invisible and essential, about the particular strangeness of caring physically for people who did not fully see her as a person. Hannah's diaries were published long after her death, and they are, in my opinion, one of the most valuable historical documents of the Victorian era. Not because they reveal anything dramatic or scandalous, though there are personal elements to her story that are genuinely complicated, but because they give us something almost impossibly rare. A working-class Victorian woman's inner life in her own words in real time. She wrote about her work with a kind of pride that I find very moving. Not a survey pride, not a performance of contentment, something more like the satisfaction of a person who was genuinely good at difficult things and knew it. She described blackening the kitchen range as a job that required skill and technique if you wanted to do it properly. She described her cooking with technical specificity. She had standards. Her standards were her own. The physical toll of domestic service on women's bodies was significant and largely undocumented in official records, which tended to focus on factory conditions rather than household ones. Housemaids routinely developed chronic knee and back problems from the constant kneeling and lifting. Laundry maids worked for hours with their arms submerged in hot water, which caused skin conditions and joint problems. Kitchen and scullery workers stood on stone or tile floors for their entire working day, often without adequate footwear in kitchens that were swelteringly hot in summer and bitterly cold in winter. Industrial workplace inspectors existed by the mid-Victorian period to document and regulate conditions in factories. There was no equivalent oversight for domestic service. The household was private, and what happened inside it was the employer's business. That privacy, combined with the live-in nature of the work, created a situation where a servant's entire existence, her hours, her diet, her accommodation, her freedom of movement, her social life was controlled by her employer. Most households had strict rules about when servants could leave the house on their days off, which were typically one afternoon per week and one Sunday per month. Followers, which meant romantic relationships, were forbidden in most households, and a servant found to have a suitor could be dismissed immediately. A woman could in theory leave a bad situation by finding another position in practice without a reference and often without savings. That was not as simple as it sounds. The economic dependency of domestic servants on their employers was in structural terms not entirely unlike the dependency of married women on their husbands. Different in important ways, obviously, but similar in the fundamental dynamic. Your security depended entirely on the continued goodwill of someone who held almost all the formal power. There is something I want to say about the relationship between these two groups of women, the mistresses and the servants, that I think matters beyond the Victorian era. Both groups were constrained, both were operating within systems that significantly limited their choices, but their constraints were not equivalent, and the temptation to draw a false equivalence between them, to say that all Victorian women suffered equally under the domestic ideology, is one I want to resist. The middle-class mistress had legal protection for her property, however limited. She had social status. She had the kind of educated cultural capital that gave her access to information and networks that a scullery maid simply did not have. Her suffering where existed was real, but it was suffering within a set of privileges that her servant did not share. And the servant had something the mistress in her domestically perfected drawing room was sometimes envied for without anyone quite saying so. She had the unglamorous but genuine dignity of work that was visibly, measurably, concretely done. A fire laid was a fire laid. A dinner cooked was a dinner cooked. A floor scrubbed was a floor you could see and assess and take some satisfaction in, even if nobody thanked you for it. The middle-class woman's work was invisible by design. The servant's work was invisible because nobody thought it mattered. They were two different kinds of eraser, and I think it is worth being precise about the difference. As the Victorian era moved into its later decades, the institution of domestic service began to change. The expansion of clerical work and shop work and factory work in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s gave working-class women more options than they had previously had. Some of those options paid worse than domestic service in cash terms, but they offered something domestic service could not: the ability to go home at the end of the day, to have an hour that was genuinely your own, to not have your entire waking life take place inside someone else's house under someone else's rules. The number of women entering domestic service began to plateau and then decline in the final decades of the 19th century. Families found it increasingly difficult to recruit good servants, particularly for the harder and less desirable roles. And this shift, this gradual incremental expansion of working-class women's options, was itself a form of resistance, a quiet, collective, almost invisible resistance. Women choosing wherever they could slightly less constraint. It was not a revolution. It was not dramatic. Nobody wrote pamphlets about it. But it was real, and it mattered. The Victorian household, I have come to think, was not one story. It was at least two running in parallel, separated by a green baize door and an enormous amount of unacknowledged complexity. Upstairs, the performed ideal of domesticity, the angel in the house, the careful maintenance of respectability. Downstairs, the actual labor that made the ideal possible, performed by women who were essential to every detail of the performance, and acknowledged in almost none of it. Both stories involve constraint. Both involve resilience. Both involve women finding ways to maintain dignity and agency inside systems that were designed without much regard for either. But the two stories are not the same story, and pretending there would be its own form of erasure. Now, here's what both stories share, and this is where I want to take you next. Both the mistress in her parlor and the servant in her kitchen lived under a kind of surveillance, a constant awareness that their behavior was being watched, evaluated, and judged against a standard they had not set and could not fully meet. For the middle-class woman, that surveillance operated through social reputation, through the conduct manuals, through the angel ideal. For the servant, it operated through the character reference, the employer's authority, the complete lack of privacy in her daily life. And for some women, particularly those whose minds or emotions or circumstances did not fit the prescribed pattern, that surveillance had an extreme consequence. A consequence that the Victorian era dressed up in medical language, but that was at its core something far more disturbing. Those women did not get rescues necessarily. Some of them got something much worse. The asylum, the institution, the official declaration that a woman who could not or would not fit the expected shape of her life was by definition not well. That is the next chapter of this story, and it is one I've been turning over in my mind for a while, because it is simultaneously the darkest part of what we're discussing tonight, and in a strange way, one of the most illuminating. There is a word I want to introduce carefully, because it carries a lot of weight, and I think it deserves to be handled with precision rather than sensationalism. The word is lunacy. In Victorian England, lunacy was not just a colloquial insult. It was a legal category, a formal designation with real procedural consequences. A person who was officially declared a lunatic lost, in a single stroke, almost every civil right possessed. They could be committed to an institution. Their property could be managed by others. Their freedom of movement could be removed indefinitely. And the decision about whether someone was a lunatic or not rested in practice with a remarkably small number of people, typically a certifying doctor, and in many cases the family members who had initiated the process. Now, here's the question I want you to sit with before we go any further. If you designed a system for confining inconvenient people, people whose behavior disrupted the social order, people whose existence was expensive or embarrassing or simply difficult to manage, what would that system look like? It would probably look a great deal like the Victorian lunacy system, particularly as it applied to women. The numbers first because they tell an important story. In the 1850s, the population of England and Wales confined in public and private asylums was roughly 30,000 people. By 1900, that number had grown to approximately 100,000. The increase was driven by multiple factors: population growth, the expansion of asylum infrastructure, changing definitions of what constituted treatable mental illness, and crucially changes in who was doing the committing and why. What the statistics also show, and what historians studying this period have documented extensively, is that women were consistently overrepresented in asylum populations relative to their share of the general population. In some institutions, and in some periods, women made up more than 60% of the committed population. The question of why requires some careful unpacking, because the answer is not simply that Victorian doctors were deliberately imprisoning sane women to protect patriarchal interests. Though there are documented cases where something uncomfortably close to that happened, the answer is more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing, because complicated systems cause harm in ways that are harder to see and harder to resist than simple ones. The Lunacy Act of 1845 established a formal framework for the certification and confinement of lunatics in England and Wales. Under this framework, a person could be committed to an asylum on the certification of 2 doctors, later reduced to 1 in some circumstances, combined with an order from a justice of the peace for poor patients, or simply a relative's request combined with medical certificates for private patients. For a married woman, the practical implication was significant. Her husband could, with the cooperation of 2 willing doctors, have her committed to a private asylum without any further legal process. She did not need to have committed a crime. She did not need to have harmed anyone. She needed only to be certified as a lunatic, and the threshold for that certification was by modern standards remarkably elastic. What counted as evidence of lunacy in a Victorian medical context? The list, when you read through the actual case records and admission documents, is genuinely startling. Excessive religiosity, excitement, despondency, moral depravity, domestic unhappiness, ill-treatment by a husband, novel reading, jealousy, overwork, suppression of the menses, disappointment in love, grief, seduction. That last one, seduction. A woman who'd been seduced, meaning in Victorian Parliament, a woman who'd had a sexual relationship outside of marriage, whether consensual or not, could be admitted to an asylum on the grounds that the experience had disordered her mind. The cause of her confinement was, in other words, what had been done to her. I want to tell you about a case that became in the 1850s something of a public scandal. Not because it was unusual, but precisely because it was so ordinary that once people looked at it clearly, it was very difficult to look away. Her name was Rosina Bulwer-Lytton. She was the wife, later the erunged wife, of Edward Bulwer-Lytton, one of the most famous novelists of the Victorian era. You may not know his name, but you almost certainly know one of his phrases. He coined the expression, "The pen is mightier than the sword." He also wrote the opening line, "It was a dark and stormy night," which has since become famous as a byword for bad writing, which I personally find delightfully ironic given the circumstances. Rosina and Edward's marriage had deteriorated badly over many years. They had separated. Edward had custody of their children. Rosina, by the 1850s, was living on a small allowance and writing novels of her own novels that were with increasing explicitness satirical portraits of her former husband. In 1858, Edward Bulwer-Lytton was standing for election as a member of Parliament. Rosina attended one of his public campaign events and from the crowd publicly accused him of a series of misconduct during their marriage in front of witnesses loudly. Within 3 weeks, she had been certified as a lunatic by 2 doctors. Doctors arranged by her husband's family and committed to a private asylum in Hertfordshire. She'd not become ill. She'd made a scene at a public meeting. She'd embarrassed a powerful man. The commitment lasted only 3 months before public outcry, particularly from other writers and journalists who found the story sufficiently disturbing to write about it. Forced a review. Rosina Balitton was released and declared sane. She went on to live for another 24 years writing and publishing throughout. But I want you to notice something about those 3 months. 3 months during which a sane woman was confined in an institution stripped of her freedom because she had publicly criticized her former husband in a way he found politically damaging. And the mechanism that made it possible was not spectacular. It was bureaucratic. It was paperwork and medical certificates and institutional procedure. It was a system doing exactly what it had been designed to do quietly, efficiently, without drama. Now, I said earlier that I did not want to reduce this to a simple story of deliberate conspiracy against women, and I stand by that, because the reality is more nuanced and I think more instructive. Many Victorian doctors who certified women as lunatics believed genuinely and in good faith that they were helping. The medical frameworks of the period encouraged doctors to interpret a wide range of female distress as pathological. A woman who was deeply unhappy in her marriage was in medical terms suffering from a nervous disorder. A woman who expressed rage or grief too dramatically was exhibiting symptoms. A woman who refused to fulfill her domestic role, who stopped cooking, stopped managing the household, stopped getting out of bed, was displaying evidence of mental illness. The possibility that a woman might be deeply unhappy for entirely rational reasons and that her distress was a sane response to an untenable situation rather than a symptom of biological disorder. That possibility existed in Victorian medical thinking, but it was significantly underweight. The system was oriented toward pathizing the response rather than examining the cause, and the result was a self-reinforcing loop. Women were placed in environments that were by any reasonable assessment distressing. They responded to those environments with distress. Their distress was then cited as evidence of the original diagnosis. In some institutions, a woman who protested her confinement was documented as demonstrating insight deficit, meaning that her refusal to accept that she was ill was itself considered a symptom of her illness. There is no exit from that logic. None at all. Let me ask you something directly. If the definition of sanity is conformity to the social role assigned to you, then what does that definition say about the social role itself? Because that is, when you strip it back, what the Victorian lunacy system was sometimes doing. It was defining sanity as the successful performance of the angel in the house ideal. Deviation from that performance, too much anger, too much ambition, too much grief, too much resistance was evidence of disorder. Which means the system was not simply punishing women who were ill. It was punishing women who were insufficiently docile. Those are not the same thing. And the conflation of them had consequences that extended far beyond the individuals who were committed. Because a system that could confine a woman for being difficult to live with operated, even when it was rarely used, as a very effective deterrent against all the other women who knew it existed. You do not need to lock everyone up to control everyone's behavior. You only need to ensure that everyone knows it is possible. There is a woman named Georgina Weldon whose story I find almost impossibly fascinating and who deserves far more historical attention than she receives. Georgina Weldon was a singer, a music teacher, and a social campaigner who had separated from her husband William Henry Weldon in the 1870s. William, wanting to remarry, attempted in 1878 to have Georgina certified as a lunatic and committed to an asylum. He engaged 3 doctors to examine her. 2 of them issued certificates. Georgina discovered the plan before it could be executed, apparently with very little time to spare, and fled the house before the asylum carriage arrived to collect her. What happened next is remarkable. Rather than simply disappearing or accepting her situation, Georgina Weldon fought back. She taught herself law. She represented herself in a series of legal actions against the doctors who had certified her, against the asylum proprietor who'd agreed to receive her, and eventually against her husband and his associates. She filed cases in multiple courts. She argued her own cases before judges. She lost some and won some. In 1884, she obtained a judgment against one of the certifying doctors for attempted false imprisonment. The damages awarded were modest, but the principle was not. A woman had gone to court, represented herself, and established that doctors could be held liable for reckless certification. She subsequently became a prominent campaigner for reform of the lunacy acts. She wrote, she lectured. She was, by most contemporary accounts, formidably intelligent, somewhat difficult, absolutely determined, and entirely sane. The three doctors who had certified her presumably had opinions on that last point, but the courts had now addressed the question, and the courts had sided with Georgina. I keep coming back to something she wrote about the experience. She described the moment she understood what was being planned for her as the moment she realized that the law, as it stood, offered her almost no protection. That the only thing standing between her freedom and a padded room was the fact that the carriage had not yet arrived. She said the experience taught her that rights are not real until they can be defended. That a right that cannot be enforced is a courtesy, not a guarantee. That observation was made in the 1870s about Victorian lunacy law. I will leave it to you to decide how relevant it remains. The reform of the lunacy laws was a slow and contested process. The Lunacy Act of 1890 introduced somewhat stricter procedural requirements for certification, requiring a reception order from a judicial authority in addition to medical certificates for private patients. This made impromptu commitment somewhat harder to arrange, though far from impossible. But the deeper problem, the medical framework that pathized female unhappiness and defined female conformity as sanity, was not addressed by legislative reform. That framework persisted well into the 20th century, evolving and adapting, but maintaining its fundamental character. The diagnosis of hysteria was not formally retired as a clinical category until 1980, when the American Psychiatric Association removed it from its diagnostic manual. 1980 within the living memory of people watching this video tonight. That is not a comfortable fact to sit with, but I think it is an important one. The women who moved through Victorian asylums left relatively little record of their own experience for obvious reasons. Their letters were often monitored. Their diaries, when they kept them, were subject to confiscation. The institutional records that survive speak about them in clinical language, case notes, admission records, treatment logs that tells us what doctors observed without telling us what the women themselves understood about what was happening to them. But occasionally something slips through. There's a set of letters held in an archive in London written by a woman admitted to Bethlehem Royal Hospital in 1882. She was admitted on her husband's application, certified for what her case notes describe as acute melancholia following the death of 2 children in quick succession. She remained at Bethlehem for 14 months before being discharged as recovered. In her letters, some of which were sent out, some of which were apparently retained and never forwarded, she wrote about her children with a clarity and specificity that is genuinely moving. She described their particular habits, the way one of them laughed, the way the other always reached for her hand when they were somewhere new. She was not writing in the language of disorder. She was writing in the language of grief. She described the ward, the routine, the other women. She wrote about a woman in the bed across from her who sang quietly to herself at night the same melody over and over, and how after a while Georgina, that was her name coincidentally, how after a while she began to find it comforting rather than disturbing. She wrote in one letter that was apparently never sent, "I am not unwell. I am bereaved. There is a difference. I know there is a difference. I wonder if anyone here has been told about it." That sentence has stayed with me since I first read it, and I think it captures something essential about everything we have been discussing tonight. Not just about the asylum, but about the entire apparatus of Victorian domesticity. The system consistently refused to name what it was doing accurately. Constraint became protection. Erasure became celebration. Grief became disorder. A woman who said otherwise was by definition not quite right in the head. And yet the women kept saying otherwise in letters sent and unsent, in diaries kept and burned, in the small, quiet, daily acts of resistance we will start to explore in the next part of our story. Because here's the thing about telling women for decades that their inner lives are symptoms. Some of them believed it. Some of them were damaged by it in ways that took years to recover from, and some in ways that were never fully recovered from. But many of them, more than the official record suggests, more than the conduct manuals and the medical textbooks and the asylum case notes would lead you to expect, simply did not buy it. They wrote in secret. They organized in drawing rooms that looked like social calls. They read voraciously the books they were told were too stimulating for their delicate constitutions. They found each other. They built networks. They kept alive in the spaces the system had not thought to surveil a version of themselves that the system insisted did not exist. Those women and what they managed to create and preserve inside the most restrictive society imaginable are the next chapter of this story. And I promise you, after everything we've been through in the last few parts, it is a chapter that genuinely gives me hope. Every revolution begins somewhere small, not in a grand hall, not with a speech that shakes the rafters. More often, it begins in a room that looks perfectly ordinary from the outside. A sitting room, perhaps with comfortable chairs arranged around a fire. A group of women who have ostensibly gathered for tea and conversation. Nothing suspicious, nothing dramatic, just women talking, except that what they were talking about in those rooms was quietly dismantling the world that had been built around them. I want to spend this part of our story in those rooms, in the hidden spaces, the private networks, the secret writings, and the small daily rebellions that Victorian women conducted almost entirely beneath the official gaze of the culture that was trying to contain them. Because I think these stories are in some ways the most important ones we have told tonight. Not because they're the most dramatic. They are often the opposite of dramatic, but because they demonstrate something essential about human nature that I find genuinely moving. People find ways through, even when the walls are very high and the doors are very few. Let's start with the diary, because diaries are where the most honest version of Victorian women tends to live. The keeping of a private diary was one of the few forms of self-expression that Victorian women were actually encouraged to practice. It was considered a suitable feminine pursuit, introspective, private, and threatening. The conduct literature of the period approved of diary keeping as a method of moral self-examination, a way of reviewing the day's activities and identifying areas for spiritual improvement. What the conduct literature did not entirely anticipate was what women would actually write in those diaries once they had a pen in their hand and the door closed. Consider the diary of Emily Shaw, who kept a journal from childhood until her death from tuberculosis at the age of 24 in 1839. Emily Shaw was not a famous woman. She was the daughter of a clergyman, educated at home, living an entirely conventional middle-class life in every external respect. She never published anything in her lifetime. She never had a public platform of any kind. But her diary is an extraordinary document. She wrote about natural history with the enthusiasm and precision of a trained scientist. She recorded bird observations, geological formations, plant specimens, weather patterns, all with the kind of systematic rigor that any young man of her era would have been channeled into a career in science or academia. She wrote about her intellectual frustrations with a frankness that is almost startling. She wrote about the specific agony of being curious about the world and having no institutional pathway through which to pursue that curiosity. She was not writing for anyone. She was writing because writing was the only form her intellectual life was permitted to take. When her diary was published posthumously by her family in 1891, it was received with considerable admiration. Readers recognized in it a mind that could have contributed significantly to the scientific understanding of her time had the structures of her world allowed for it. Several reviewers used the word tragic. I think that is the right word. But I also think there is something else in Emily Shaw's diary alongside the tragedy. Something stubborn and alive. She did not stop thinking because she had nowhere to go with her thoughts. She just wrote them down, kept them, left them for us to find. That is its own form of defiance. The literary salon was another form of hidden infrastructure, and I want to give it more attention than it typically receives, because it was more significant than the term might suggest. In the popular imagination, a Victorian literary salon sounds like a pleasant social gathering where witty people said clever things and then went home. And on the surface, that is exactly what they looked like. A hostess invited guests, writers, intellectuals, artists, sometimes politicians, to her home for an evening of conversation. Refreshments were served, ideas were exchanged, very civilized. But beneath that civilized surface, the literary salon functioned as something closer to a professional network. And for women, it was often the only professional network available to them. Consider what a salon actually provided. It gave women access to the intellectual and publishing world without requiring them to occupy any formal position within it. A woman could not be a member of the major London clubs where literary men gathered. She could not join the professional societies. She could not attend the dinners and gatherings that functioned as the real currency exchange of the Victorian intellectual world, where commissions were arranged, reputations were built, and introductions were made. But she could host a salon, and if she hosted it well, the salon came to her. A woman like Anne Thackeray Ritchie, daughter of William Makepeace there, and a novelist and essayist in her own right, used her social position and her drawing room to create a space where writers and thinkers gathered regularly. The connections made in rooms like hers were genuinely professionally valuable. Books were reviewed, publishers were introduced, careers were quietly advanced. The salon gave women a form of influence that the official structures of Victorian intellectual life denied them. It was informal, which meant it was not taken entirely seriously. But informal does not mean ineffective. Some of the most consequential professional relationships of the Victorian literary world were formed over cups of tea in women's drawing rooms. Now, let me tell you about a woman whose life was in many ways the most extraordinary double existence I've encountered in researching this period. Her name was Anne Leicester. She was born in 1791 in Yorkshire, which technically puts her life slightly before the Victorian era, as we have been defining it. But her story is so directly relevant to everything we've been discussing that I want to include her here. And I think once you hear it, you will agree. Anne Leicester kept a diary for most of her adult life. It ran to approximately 5 million words across multiple volumes. And approximately 1/16 of that diary was written in a private code, a cipher she developed herself, combining elements of Greek letters, mathematical symbols, and punctuation marks. The coded sections of the diary contained the parts of her life that she understood with complete clarity could not be written in plain English. They contained a detailed and remarkably frank record of her emotional and intimate life, her relationships with women, her desires, her strategies for managing those desires within a society that had no legitimate place for them. Anne Leicester was a woman who understood exactly what she was in a century that had no language for it, and she wrote it all down anyway in a code she was reasonably confident no one around her would break. The diaries were discovered after her death, and the coded sections eventually deciphered in the 20th century. They are now recognized as one of the most significant private historical documents of the early 19th century, an intimate first-person account of a life lived almost entirely in the hidden spaces of conventional society. She managed her family estate in Yorkshire. She traveled extensively across Europe. She dressed in a manner that was distinctively masculine by the standards of her time. She wore exclusively black and was known locally as Gentleman Jack, a nickname she was apparently quite comfortable with. She conducted her affairs and her business with formidable competence, and she wrote in the pages of her coded diary an honest account of who she was that she could share with no one during her lifetime. She found a way to be herself fully and without apology in a world that had absolutely no framework for what she was. The code was not just practical protection. It was a declaration. I exist. I know I exist. I am writing it down. The reading of transgressive books was another form of quiet rebellion that I find consistently underestimated in historical accounts of this period. I mentioned in an earlier part of this story that women were advised against excessive reading, particularly of novels, on the grounds that fiction stimulated the emotions and could excite the nervous system to dangerous effect. This was a genuinely held medical opinion, not merely a figure of speech. And yet women read voraciously in many cases, borrowing books through lending libraries, sharing novels with friends, reading in their bedrooms when a household had retired, hiding books that they knew would be disapproved of. The private reading habits of Victorian women were in many cases significantly more adventurous than the public record suggests. The circulating library, particularly Mudie's Select Library, which became the dominant lending library in mid-Victorian England, was both a conduit and a site of contestation. Charles Edward Mudie, who ran it, was famously conservative in his selections, explicitly declining to stock novels he considered morally unsuitable. His library was positioned as a safe, respectable source of approved reading material for middle-class families. But the demand for books that tested moral boundaries was real and persistent. Publishers knew it, authors knew it, and the women who were the primary customers of the lending libraries knew it too. When George Eliot published Middlemarch in the 1870s, a novel with a deeply complex, intellectually formidable female protagonist who refuses to have her life simplified into any available category, the readership was overwhelmingly female. When Thomas Hardy wrote about women trapped in impossible social situations with the sympathy and precision that was unusual for a male author of the period, women read him in enormous numbers. They were not just being entertained. They were, I think, doing something else. They were finding in fiction the acknowledgement of their experience that the official culture consistently withheld. They were reading characters who felt what they felt, who wanted what they wanted, who struggled with exactly the contradictions that structured their own lives. That is not a trivial thing. It is in a very real sense how people find out that they are not alone. There was a particular network that developed in the 1860s and 1870s that I want to describe because I think it represents one of the most creative forms of resistance in this entire period. It was not formally organized. It had no official name. It operated through correspondence, through personal visits, through shared subscriptions to specific periodicals, through the borrowing and passing of specific books. It was a network of women, mostly middle class, mostly educated to some degree, spread across England, who were engaged in what might be described as a sustained collective conversation about the conditions of their lives. Some of the women in this network were writers. Some were involved in early charitable and reform organizations. Some were simply women with enough education to read and enough privacy to write letters. And what they wrote to each other in those letters was often strikingly direct. They wrote about marriage, about the specific disappointments and frustrations and occasional satisfactions of their domestic lives, with a frankness that was almost entirely absent from the public discourse of the period. They wrote about their intellectual ambitions. They wrote about books and about what the books meant to them. They wrote about money and the lack of it and the humiliation of financial dependence. They wrote about their children, their bodies, their health, their fears. These letters were private. They were not intended for publication. And in that privacy, a space existed where women could be honest with each other in ways that the official culture did not permit. Historians who have studied this correspondence describe it as a kind of alternative public sphere, a network of communication and mutual support that existed in parallel with the official male-dominated public sphere, invisible to it, but genuinely functional. It is worth noting that much of this correspondence was deliberately destroyed. Women burned their letters or asked correspondents to burn theirs specifically because they understood what the existence of such frankness could mean if it fell into the wrong hands. The survival rate of the letters we do have is in historical terms somewhat accidental. We are reading the ones that were overlooked or that the recipients could not bring themselves to destroy, or that survive through chains of inheritance that nobody had thought to interrupt. Which means the correspondence we can read today is almost certainly more cautious than the correspondence we have lost. The most honest letters are gone. Let me tell you about a form of resistance that I find particularly inventive because it operated entirely in plain sight. The charitable work of Victorian women is generally treated in historical accounts as an expression of feminine compassion, a natural extension of the domestic caring role into the slightly wider community, perfectly consistent with the angel in the house. Ideal, nothing threatening about it all. And that is exactly how it was designed to look. But consider what charitable work actually gave women, practically speaking. It gave them a reason to leave the house without requiring their husband's specific permission for each individual trip. Charitable, visiting, calling on poor, families in their homes, delivering food or medicine or religious tracts, required women to move independently through the city, to make judgments and decisions on their own, to interact with a wide range of people from all social classes. All of this was officially sanctioned because it was framed as spiritual duty. It also gave them access to organizational experience that was not available to them in any other context. Running a charitable committee required administrative skills, financial management, leadership, and strategic thinking. Women who ran successful charitable organizations were developing exactly the capacities that the official ideology insisted they did not have and did not need. By the 1850s and 1860s, the network of women's charitable organizations across England was genuinely substantial, and many of the women who would go on to campaign for women's education, for legal reform for the suffrage, many of them had their first experience of organized collective action through charitable work. They had learned in the course of doing something that looked entirely respectable how to run a campaign. The system had tried to channel their energy into the domestic and the devotional. They took that channel and used it to build something else entirely. I want to close this section with a woman who, for my money, represents the most elegant piece of tactical intelligence in this entire period. Her name was Barbara Lee Smith-Bodishin. She was born in 1827, the daughter of a radical politician who believed in women's education and had the unusual habit of actually acting on his beliefs. Barbara was educated seriously, given a real income of her own at the age of 21, and grew up with a sense of what financial and intellectual independence actually felt like. She then spent much of her adult life trying to ensure that other women could have the same thing. In 1854, she published a pamphlet called A Brief Summary in Plain Language of the Most Important Laws of England Concerning Women. It did exactly what the title suggests. It took the complex technical language of Victorian property and marriage law and translated it into plain English that any educated woman could understand. The pamphlet was deliberately, specifically practical. It was not a philosophical treatise about women's rights. It was a legal briefing document. It told women in clear language what their rights actually were, which was in many cases the first time they had ever been told. It circulated widely. It was read and passed around and discussed. And the information it contained was in a very real sense power, because you cannot identify a problem or organize around addressing it if you do not first understand what the problem actually is. Barbara Bodishin went on to co-found Girton College at Cambridge, one of the first colleges to provide women with access to higher education at university level. She was a painter of genuine talent, an activist, a campaigner, a builder of institutions. She did not achieve everything she aimed for in her lifetime. Girton students could not take full Cambridge degrees until 1948. But she understood something that I think is worth carrying with us. As this story continues, she understood that information is a form of liberation. That the first thing any system of control does is withhold information from the people it is controlling about their own rights, their own history, their own capabilities, their own options, and that the first act of any genuine resistance is to fill that gap. The women we have been discussing in this part of the story did not lead armies. They did not storm institutions. They did not, for the most part, make speeches from public platforms, though some eventually did. What they did was quieter, and I want to argue in some ways more radical. They maintained in the spaces the system had not thought to look the idea that they were full human beings with inner lives worth recording, with intellectual capacities worth developing, with experiences worth articulating honestly, with futures worth fighting for. They kept that idea alive in diaries and letters and coded journals and novels and charitable committees and drawing room conversations and pamphlets translated into plain English. And they passed it forward to daughters and students and correspondents and readers they would never meet. which is how gradually something that had been a whisper became a voice, and then something louder. But before we get to the campaigns and the legislation and the public battles, before we talk about what Victorian women fought for openly, there's one more hidden story we need to sit with. Because everything we've discussed tonight has circled around the home as a symbolic space. The home is ideal as cage, as performance, as workplace, as legal jurisdiction. What we have not yet looked at carefully enough is the home as a site of grief, of specific concrete physical loss that Victorian women were expected to absorb quietly and without adequate acknowledgement. The deaths, the pregnancies, the children, the particular sorrows of the Victorian nursery in the Victorian childbed. That is a story that requires its own space, its own careful attention. And that is exactly where we're going next. Some stories are harder to tell than others. Not because the facts are unclear or because the history is complicated in ways that require careful navigation, but because the subject matter is the kind that asks something of you as a listener, that asks you to slow down, to actually feel for a moment what you're being told about rather than simply processing it as information. This is one of those stories. We're going to talk about childbirth and children and death, about the specific intimate physical sorrow that was woven so deeply into Victorian women's lives that it was simply considered part of the texture of existence. Expected normal, something you absorbed and continued. I want to tell it carefully and I want to tell it honestly. Start with a number. In 1850, the maternal mortality rate in England, meaning the number of women who died as a direct result of childbirth or its immediate complications, was approximately 5 per thousand. Births. That sounds modest until you think about what it means across an entire population and across an entire reproductive lifetime. A middle-class Victorian woman who married in her early 20s and lived to her mid-40s might experience somewhere between 6 and 8 pregnancies over the course of her marriage. The average number of live births for married Victorian women across the mid-9th century was consistently above 5, and in many families considerably higher. Queen Victoria herself had 9 children. The expectation was not simply that you would have children. The expectation was that children would be a more or less continuous feature of your adult life for 2 decades. Now calculate that maternal mortality rate across multiple pregnancies and across millions of women, and then add the complications that did not kill women immediately, but that left them with chronic health problems, pelvic injuries, infections, physical damage from difficult births, the cumulative toll of repeated pregnancies on bodies that had no meaningful nutritional support, no antibiotics, and no pain relief beyond what a sympathetic doctor might choose to offer. The Victorian era had chloroform available from the late 1840s onward, and some progressive obstetricians used it, but its use in childbirth was controversial. There was a genuine theological argument that pain in childbirth was divinely ordained, a consequence of original sin that women were supposed to endure, not circumvent. Some doctors shared this view. Others simply considered the risk of anesthesia too high to justify in routine births. The result was that the majority of Victorian women gave birth without meaningful pain relief in their own homes, typically in the presence of a midwife if they could afford one, or sometimes simply in the presence of other women, a neighbor, a relative, a servant who had done this before and knew what to expect. What strikes me most about Victorian childbirth when I really sit with the historical record is not the physical danger, is the isolation. In an era when women's emotional lives were heavily prescribed and managed, childbirth was one of the experiences for which almost no honest emotional preparation was provided. Young women entering marriage were not told in most cases what the physical reality of childbirth involved. The subject was considered too indelicate for direct discussion. A girl approaching her first labor often did so with only the vaguest understanding of what was about to happen to her body, gleaned from whispered conversations with married friends, from heavily euphemistic medical pamphlets, from the visible fact that women sometimes died doing this, and try not to think about it too directly. The moment of delivery itself was paradoxically one of the most physically surrounded and emotionally lonely experiences in a Victorian woman's life. The room was full of people. But the experience of what was happening was entirely her own, and there was very little framework for talking about it, honestly, either before or afterward. Afterward is the part one want to focus on, actually, because I think it is significantly underexamined. The expectation for a Victorian woman after a successful birth was recovery. Quiet recovery in the bed for a prescribed period, typically somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks for women who could afford not to work. Then resumption of household duties, of social obligations of the next pregnancy, which in many cases began within the year. The possibility that a woman might need more time, that she might be struggling with something beyond physical recovery, that the experience of childbirth, the fear, the pain, the sudden responsibility, the complicated emotional territory of new motherhood might require more than a few weeks in bed, and then a return to normal. That possibility existed at the margins of Victorian medical thinking, but it was not the mainstream response. The mainstream response was, in essence, you are a woman. This is what women do now. Continue. And then there were the children who did not survive. Infant mortality in Victorian England was extraordinary by modern standards. In the early Victorian period, roughly 1 in 6 children born in England died before their first birthday. In the worst urban slums in the crowded, poorly drained, contaminated tenement districts of London and Manchester and Liverpool, the figure was considerably higher. In some districts in the 1840s, more than half of all children born did not survive to their FDH birthday. Even in middle-class households with better nutrition and cleaner water, and the ability to call a doctor, the death of a child in infancy or early childhood was not rare. It was a normal, expected, statistically likely event in the life of a Victorian family. Most parents who had several children would lose at least one. Many lost more than one. Some lost more than they kept. I want to pause here and ask you something. How do you grieve repeatedly for something that everyone around you treats as normal? How do you mourn a child in a culture that has built elaborate systems for managing that mourning, but almost no systems for actually processing the loss? Because Victorian mourning culture was highly ritualized and highly specific. There were rules, precise, detailed, socially enforced rules about what a widow was supposed to wear and for how long. A widow was expected to dress in full mourning black for at least 2 years. She was expected to withdraw from social life during the first period of deep mourning, to appear in public only in deeply somber dress, to observe particular restrictions on social activity for up to 4 years in some codes of etiquette. But here is what is interesting and what tells you something important about what mourning culture was actually doing. Those rules applied primarily to widows, to women who had lost husbands. The loss of a child, which was at least as common, if not more so, and which devastated parents in ways that the historical record makes very clear, did not carry the same elaborate framework. There's a period of mourning dress, yes, but it was shorter, less prescribed, less public. A mother who had lost a baby was expected to grieve privately, to continue functioning, to have another child if she could. The death of an infant, particularly a very young infant, was acknowledged but not dwelt upon. The emotional reality of those repeated losses was supposed to be absorbed quietly and carried forward without public acknowledgement. Let me tell you about a woman named Elizabeth Barrett before she became Elizabeth Barrett Browning, before the famous love story with Robert, before the poetry that made her one of the most celebrated writers of the Victorian era. In 1838, Elizabeth Barrett was 32 years old and seriously ill with a lung condition that had already confined her largely to her room for several years. In that same year, her brother Edward, her closest sibling, the person she described as the companion of her mind, drowned in a sailing accident at Toki, where he had come specifically to be with her during her illness. She had asked him to come. She knew that it was the kind of knowledge that does not leave. The grief that followed was by any account devastating. Elizabeth Barrett spent the next several years in a state of near total withdrawal. She rarely left her room. She saw almost no one. She wrote because writing was the thing that remained when everything else had contracted. But even the writing came slowly and at considerable cost. Her family and the doctors who attended her described her condition primarily in physical terms. Her lungs, her weakness, her need for rest and quiet. The possibility that she was also experiencing a profound and complicated grief, not just for her brother, but for the loss of health, for the loss of a version of her life. She had imagined that psychological dimension was present in the medical notes, but was not foreground. She was treated as a body that needed to recover the mind inside that body, and what it was going through was secondary. What saved her in some sense was letters. A correspondence that began in 1845 with a poet named Robert Browning, who wrote to her after reading her work and told her in that first letter that he loved her verses with all his heart. The correspondence deepened over weeks and months, conducted almost entirely by letter because she so rarely received visitors. And in those letters, Elizabeth Barrett began to write honestly about her inner life in ways that her physical confinement had paradoxically both enforced and enabled. She eventually eloped with Robert Browning in 1846, defying her father, who had forbidden marriage to any of his children for reasons that were, to put it generously, more about his own needs than theirs. She went to Italy, where her health improved dramatically in the warmer climate. She published some of her finest work. She lost a pregnancy in 1847 and went on to have a son in 1849, a birth she described in her letters with a specificity and wonder that still reads as completely genuine across 170 years. She died in 1861 at 55 in Robert's arms. What I carry from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's story is not the romance, lovely as it is. It is the years before the room, the letters, the specific way that grief and illness and confinement and intellectual isolation created a pressure inside her that eventually had to find a way out. And the fact that it found its way out through language, through the most essentially human form of communication, rather than being absorbed into silence, as it was supposed to be. The loss of children across the Victorian period produced a grief culture that was in some ways extraordinarily rich, and in other ways deeply inadequate. On the rich side, photography, which became widely accessible from the 1840s onward, transformed the mourning of children in ways that still feel moving and slightly startling to encounter. Victorian families had photographs taken of their deceased children, carefully posed, sometimes in the arms of parents or siblings, sometimes alone, dressed as if sleeping. These were memorial photographs intended to preserve the image of a child who'd existed briefly and left almost no other trace. The practice looks strange to modern eyes, but I think if you approach it with any generosity at all, you can understand exactly what it was. It was parents saying this child was real. This child had a face. This child was here, and the fact that they were here matters, even if the world will not remember it. There is also a tradition of hair work, the preservation of a deceased child's hair in mourning jewelry or decorative frames, sometimes woven into elaborate patterns. Lockets containing locks of hair from dead children were common items in Victorian women's jewelry boxes. They were worn, held, kept close. These practices were forms of grief that operated outside the official emotional framework. They were personal, material, physical. They said something that the culture's official response to child death, stoic acceptance, Christian resignation, swift resumption of normal life refused to say. They said, "I am not over this," and "I am not supposed to pretend I am." The specific vulnerability of women during and after childbirth was a subject that reformers of the period engaged with in ways that, again, were more complicated than they might appear. Purple fever, what we now understand as a bacterial infection introduced during or after delivery, was the single largest cause of maternal death in the Victorian era. It killed women in epidemics in maternity hospitals, and it killed women in smaller numbers in home births. The mortality rate from puerperal fever in some hospital maternity wards in the early Victorian period was genuinely catastrophic. In some institutions, between 10 and 35% of women who delivered there died of it. Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician working in Vienna in the 1840s, demonstrated with careful statistical analysis that the incidence of puerperal fever was dramatically lower in wards staffed by midwives than in wards staffed by medical students who came directly from performing autopsies without washing their hands. He proposed that doctors were carrying something what we would now call bacterial infection from the dissecting room to the delivery room. He was largely ignored. His colleagues found the implication that doctors were killing patients both implausible and offensive. He was eventually dismissed from his position. His mental health deteriorated significantly under the sustained professional rejection, and he died in an asylum in 1865, which, given everything we discussed in the last section, has an awful kind of irony to it. Joseph Listester's work on antiseptic technique in the 1860s eventually provided the theoretical framework that vindicated Semlis. Hand-washing and antiseptic practice gradually became standard. Maternal mortality from puerperal fever began to decline in the final decades of the Victorian era. But for the women who died in the decades before that change, women who died in childbirth in hospitals because the doctors attending them had not washed their hands, there is something particularly painful about knowing that the knowledge required to save them existed and was dismissed, and that the cost of that dismissal was measured in women's lives. I want to come back before we move on to Queen Victoria herself, because her relationship to childbirth and its aftermath is genuinely illuminating, and because she's often presented as a symbol of Victorian domesticity in ways that flatten a much more interesting and complicated reality. Victoria had 9 children between 1840 and 1857. She gave birth almost once every 2 years for 17 years. She was, by her own account, not a woman who loved pregnancy or the early stages of motherhood. She wrote in letters to her daughter Vicky after Vicky's first pregnancy, with a frankness that Victorian queens were not supposed to demonstrate that childbirth was an experience she would not recommend to anyone, that babies were demanding and exhausting, and that the sentimental image of motherhood was rather different from the physical and emotional reality of it. She also wrote about the specific loneliness of the postpartum period, about the way a woman could be surrounded by family and servants and well wishes and still feel at some essential level entirely alone with an experience that no one around her was really seeing. This is Queen Victoria writing this, the woman who was simultaneously the symbol of ideal domesticity and the ruler of an empire. And she was saying in her private correspondence, "This is harder than anyone will tell you and lonelier than it looks." If the most powerful woman in the country felt that isolation felt the gap between the official narrative of motherhood and the private reality of it, then what does that tell us about the millions of women who had none of her resources, none of her status, and no outlet whatsoever for the honest expression of their experience? Victorian women carried grief in ways that the culture around them consistently underestimated and under-resourced. They lost children they had named and not yet named. They lost versions of themselves in the process of becoming mothers. They lost friends to the same illnesses they themselves survived by chance. And they were expected throughout all of it to continue to manage to present the smooth, composed surface of the angel in the house, while the interior was something considerably less orderly. Some of them bent under that weight, some broke, and some, the ones who fascinate me most, found ways to use their grief rather than simply absorb it, channeled it into writing, into advocacy, into the slow, patient work of changing the conditions that made so much of that grief unnecessary. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who became the first woman to qualify as a physician in England in 1865, overcoming years of institutional resistance in a story that deserves its own video, was motivated in part by the specific personal knowledge of how inadequately women's medical needs were being served. She had watched women suffer and die from things that did not need to be fatal. She had watched women's pain be dismissed and their bodies be managed by people who did not fully see them as persons. She decided to become the kind of doctor she had needed and not found. That is the through line I want to carry forward. The grief was real. The loss was real. The inadequacy of the system supposed to support women through all of it, that was real too. But so was the response, the determination, quiet and steady, and in many cases anonymous, to change things, to make the next generation's experience less brutal than the current one. That determination built something slowly, imperfectly, at enormous personal cost to the women who did the building. And what it built: the campaigns, the legislation, the education, the first cracks in a wall that had held so long. That is the story we've been building toward all evening. We are almost there, because the next part of our story is where the grief and the resistance and all the quiet, hidden rebellion we've been tracking finally breaks the surface. Where the whispers become voices. Where the drawing room conversations become public campaigns. Where the women who had been told for decades that their proper place was behind a closed door start walking through it. The fight for rights is where we are headed. And I want to tell it the way it actually happened. Not as a triumphant march forward, but as the complicated, contested, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes extraordinary human story it really was. Here is something that I think gets lost in most histories of this period. The women who fought to change Victorian society were not by in large firebrands. They were not, for the most part, radicals who had rejected the world around them wholesale. They were overwhelmingly women who had grown up inside the system we have been describing all evening, who had absorbed its values, internalized its expectations, loved people within it, and who had at some point looked around them with clear eyes and simply concluded that it was not good enough. That distinction matters to me because it changes the nature of the story. It is not a story about outsiders attacking a world they despised. It is a story about people who belonged to a world who understood it intimately and who decided at considerable personal cost to try to make it better. The beginning of that effort is where we are going now. And I want to tell it carefully because the popular account of Victorian women's rights campaigns tends to flatten a very complex and contested movement into a simple march toward victory. The real story is messier and more interesting than that. Let us start with education, because I think it is the thread that when you pull it eventually unravels everything else. In 1848, two colleges in London, Queen's College and Bedford College, began offering courses to women. They were not degree-granting institutions. They were not the equivalent of the universities available to men, but they represented a formal acknowledgement for the first time in modern English history that women might benefit from systematic intellectual education beyond the domestic accomplishments of embroidery and piano. The women who enrolled in those early courses were doing something that required a specific kind of nerve. Not dramatic protest, march nerve. Quieter than that. The nerve to sit in a room and claim simply by being there that your mind was worth developing. That you deserved access to knowledge as a matter of right rather than as a consequence of some man's generosity. In a culture that had spent decades insisting that female intellect was at best unnecessary and at worst physiologically dangerous, that quiet act of sitting down in a classroom carried real weight. By the late 1860s, the campaign for women's higher education had reached Cambridge. Emily Davies, a woman whose organizational intelligence I find frankly remarkable, had spent years building the case brick by careful brick for a college that would prepare women to sit the same examinations as Cambridge men. She did not do it dramatically. She did not make rousing speeches, at least not primarily. She made arguments. She gathered data. She built relationships with sympathetic men inside the Cambridge establishment who could advocate from within. She raised money, a slow, painstaking, unglamorous process of letter writing and personal solicitation that consumed years of her life. She negotiated compromised, where she had to held firm, where she could not afford not to. And in 1869, she opened Girton College, initially in Hitchin, 20 miles from Cambridge and later on the Cambridge outskirts proper. Her logic for the location decision is one of my favorite details of the entire Victorian women's education story. She specifically wanted the women's college to be close enough to Cambridge to be genuinely part of its intellectual world, but she also knew that placing it in the town itself would generate so much resistance that the whole project might be destroyed before it began. So she found the closest acceptable compromise, 20m near enough to matter, far enough to be politically survivable. That is a level of tactical precision that deserves genuine admiration. The examination results that began coming out of Girton and its sister institution, Newnham College, founded in 1871, did something that arguments alone had not quite managed. They produced evidence. In 1890, a woman named Philippa Forsett, daughter of the suffragist Millicent Forsett, which is not a coincidence. These families' thought in generations set the Cambridge mathematical tripos examination. The mathematical tripos was considered one of the most demanding academic examinations in the world. Its top performers were celebrated publicly. The ranking of candidates was announced in the Senate House in front of a crowd that gathered specifically to hear the results. Philippa Forset's score placed her above the senior wrangler, the man who had achieved the highest score among the male candidates. The announcement of this result produced a scene that contemporaries described as remarkable. The crowd in the Senate House, which had expected the usual announcement of male rankings, heard instead that the top female candidate had outperformed the top male candidate. The reaction was by multiple accounts a mixture of cheering and stunned silence. It is worth pausing to appreciate the specific nature of what had just happened. The argument against women's higher education rested at its foundation on the claim that women were not intellectually capable of academic work at the highest levels, that their minds were constitutionally unsuited to rigorous systematic thought, that educating them beyond a certain level was both pointless and potentially harmful. Philip Forset had just in public in front of witnesses with documentary evidence demonstrated that this argument was factually incorrect. She could not receive a degree. Cambridge would not award degrees to women until 1948. But the result stood in the record, and nobody could undo it. The campaign for women's suffrage is the part of this story that most people know or think they know. And I want to spend some time with it because the popular understanding tends to skip over several decades of groundwork in favor of the dramatic final years. The suffrage campaign in England had been building since at least the 1860s. John Stuart Mill, who we've mentioned previously, presented a petition to Parliament in 1866 calling for women's suffrage, the first time the question had been formally raised in the House of Commons. The petition he organized by, among others, Barbara Lee Smith Bodishin, whose work on women's legal rights we discussed in the last section. The petition was defeated. This was not surprising. What was significant was that it had been presented at all. The question had been placed in the official record. It cannot be entirely ignored. Over the following decades, the suffrage movement developed multiple organizations with different strategies, different social bases, and genuinely different ideas about how to achieve the goal. This is the part that the simplified narrative tends to ally the enormous diversity within the women's movement and the genuine, sometimes fierce disagreements about tactics, priorities, and what kind of change was actually being sought. There were women who wanted suffrage for propertied women, first arguing that a limited victory was better than continued defeat. There were women who wanted full universal suffrage from the beginning, arguing that a partial victory would simply entrench class privilege in a new form. There were women who believed that patient constitutional methods, petitions, lobbying public education were both morally correct and strategically sound. And there were women who concluded, after decades of patient constitutional methods, producing very little result, that more disruptive tactics were necessary. The split between these positions was not just philosophical. It was personal. It divided friendships, families, and organizations that had worked together for years. Millicent Garrett Forset is one of the figures I want to spend some time with because she tends to be overshadowed in the popular account by the more dramatic Pankhurst, and I think that overshadowing is a historical injustice. Millicent Forset led the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the constitutional wing of the movement from 1897, though she had been active in the cause for decades before that. She was the younger sister of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first woman to qualify as a physician in England, which tells you something about the family she came from. She was precise, patient, strategically brilliant, and possessed of a self-discipline that is almost intimidating to contemplate. She ran the constitutional suffrage campaign for the better part of 50 years. 50 years of petitions and lobbying and public meetings and parliamentary disappointments and organizational management and the daily grinding work of keeping a movement together when its members were exhausted and its opponents were entrenched. I find myself thinking about what that kind of sustained commitment actually requires. Not the excitement of direct action, not the adrenaline of confrontation. The much harder thing of continuing to work patiently and methodically for a goal that keeps reseeding in an environment that keeps finding new ways to dismiss you. Foray never stopped believing that the argument would eventually prevail, that the evidence would accumulate, the world would change, and the vote would come through persuasion rather than force. When partial women's suffrage was granted in 1918, women over 30 who met a property qualification could now vote. Millicent Fawcett was 71 years old. She'd been working toward this moment for more than half a century. She reportedly sat quietly in the House of Commons gallery when the bill passed and wept. Now the Pankhursts, Emmeline Pankhurst, founded the Women's Social and Political Union in 1903 after years of involvement in the constitutional suffrage movement had convinced her that constitutional methods alone were not going to be sufficient. The WSBU adopted a deliberately confrontational approach. Public demonstrations, disruption of political meetings, heckling of ministers, civil disobedience. And then from around 1909 onward, something that went considerably further than any of that. Window smashing, arson of empty buildings, destruction of property, hunger strikes by imprisoned activists, which in turn provoked the government's use of force feeding, a procedure that was medically and ethically deeply questionable and which generated significant public revulsion when it became widely known. I want to be honest about how I think about this period because I think the easiest thing is to take a strong position in one direction or the other, either to celebrate the militancy as heroic necessity or to condemn it as counterproductive extremism. And either position oversimplify something genuinely complex. The women who engaged in militant action were not doing so frivolously. They had watched the constitutional movement make limited progress over decades. They were operating within a political system that had repeatedly and explicitly demonstrated its willingness to dismiss their claims indefinitely. The move toward more radical tactics was in many cases a rational response to a situation in which rational argument had been consistently disregarded. And at the same time, the militant campaign was diversive in ways that its organizers sometimes underestimated. It alienated potential allies. It gave opponents a convenient narrative about female irrationality, and it caused genuine rifts within the women's movement that took years to heal. Sylvia Pankhurst, Emmeline's daughter, eventually broke with the WSBU specifically because she believed the militant campaign had become disconnected from the working-class women whose lives it was supposedly trying to improve. She went on to organize in the East End of London, building a movement that combined suffrage with broader labor and social reform, a combination that the WSBU under Emmeline increasingly avoided. The disagreement between mother and daughter was not just tactical. It was about what the movement was fundamentally for. Whether the goal was women's suffrage as a discrete legal change or something larger, a transformation of the social and economic structures that shaped women's lives at every level. That question did not have a clean answer in 1913. In some respects, it still does not. There is a figure in this story who tends to get overlooked entirely in the popular account, and I want to give her a moment, because her story illuminates something important about who the Victorian women's movement actually included. Her name was Annie Besant. She was born in 1847, married young to a clergyman, and found within a few years of marriage that she could not reconcile herself to the religious and social conformity her position required. She separated from her husband, losing custody of her daughter in the process, a consequence of exactly the laws we discussed earlier in this story. She became a free thinker, a journalist, a public speaker, and a campaigner on a dizzying range of causes. In 1877, she and a co-author republished a pamphlet on birth control, a topic so controversial that they were prosecuted for obscene publication. The trial was in some ways their objective. It generated enormous publicity, brought the subject into mainstream public discussion, and ended in a technical legal victory. The significance of the birth control question for women's lives was not abstract. The ability to limit the number of pregnancies a woman experienced was directly connected to everything we have been discussing, to her physical health, her financial situation, her capacity to work if she chose her survival. The women bearing 6, 7, 8 children across 2 decades of marriage were not making free choices about family size in any meaningful sense. Contraceptive knowledge was stigmatized, suppressed, and largely inaccessible to women who needed it most. Annie Biss put that knowledge in a pamphlet and sold it publicly. And then she stood in a courtroom and defended her right to do so. She was also deeply involved in labor organizing. Her role in the 1888 London matchgirl strike, which we touched on earlier, was central to its success. The matchgirls who worked at Bryant and May factory were predominantly young women working in appalling conditions for poverty wages, suffering serious health consequences from white phosphorus exposure. Their strike was one of the early victories of the new unionism movement, and it demonstrated that working-class women could organize effectively and win. Annie Besant did not fit neatly into any of the categories the era had prepared for women. She was not the angel in the house. She was not the respectable middle-class reformer working within approved channels. She was something the Victorian era found genuinely unsettling. A woman who said exactly what she thought about subjects she was not supposed to address to audiences she was not supposed to be addressing without apparent concern for the consequences. She faced considerable social ostracism. She lost her daughter. She endured legal prosecution. She continued anyway. Something I keep returning to as I think about this entire period of the women's rights movement is the question of what it cost the individual women who drove it. Not in the abstract, not the general observation that reform is difficult and progress is slow, but specifically personally. Millicent Fawcett's husband, Henry Fawcett, was also a committed supporter of women's suffrage. He was one of the men in Parliament who consistently advocated for the cause from within. He died in 1884, leaving Mealy's, a widow at 37, with a daughter to raise and a campaign to continue. She had the option at that point of stepping back, of retreating into private life, of letting the cause find another leader. She did not take it. Emily Davies, who founded Girton, spent decades of her life in a state of financial precarity, relying on donations and personal economies to fund her work. Because the cause consumed resources she did not independently have, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson had to fight literally for years to gain admission to professional examinations that men were permitted to sit as a matter of routine. She was refused admission by multiple medical societies. She found a loophole in the regulations of the Society of Apothecaries, which had not specifically excluded women because no one had thought it necessary and qualified through that route in 1865. The society promptly changed its rules to close the loophole. She qualified anyway. She had already qualified. Each of these women paid a specific, personal, often undiscussed price for doing what they did. They paid it anyway. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 granted the vote to women over 30 who met a property qualification. It was partial. It was unequal. And almost everyone involved knew it was not the final destination. Full equal suffrage. Women over 21 of voting on the same terms as men came in 1928. The Equal Franchise Act, the year that Millicent Fawcett, aged 81, finally saw the thing she had spent 50 years working toward made complete law. She died the following year in 1929. I find something quietly significant in that timing. As if having seen the thing completed, she could finally rest. The vote is often presented as the culmination of the Victorian women's rights story. The end point, the achievement that makes sense of everything that came before. But here's what I think is worth adding as we come toward the end of tonight's story. The vote was not the end. It was a beginning. A formal recognition that women were citizens, not household ornaments or legal dependents or moral symbols. That their perspectives on public life mattered and deserved to be counted. But the vote did not dismantle the ideology we've been tracing all evening. It did not immediately undo the economic structures, the medical assumptions, the cultural expectations, the domestic arrangements that had shaped women's lives for 64 years of Victorian history, and for much longer before that. Those things changed too over the decades that followed. Slowly, incompletely, with setbacks and reversals, and the regular discovery that progress made in one area does not automatically transfer to others. And some of them, if we're being fully honest, have not finished changing yet. That is the last part of tonight's story. The part where we pull back from the Victorian era, from the Green Bay doors and the corsets and the lunacy certifications and the coded diaries, and look at what that world left behind, what we inherited from it, what we're still sometimes without knowing it carrying. That is where we're going next. And I think it might be the most personally relevant part of everything we have discussed tonight. Before we get to the legacy, I want to tell you about a moment that happened in a parliamentary committee room in London in 1908. A group of women had been petitioning, lobbying, and presenting evidence to various parliamentary committees for the better part of 3 decades by this point. On this particular occasion, a member of the committee, a man who had presumably been sitting through hours of careful, documented, logically argued testimony, looked at the woman presenting before him and asked with what sounds in the record like genuine puzzlement whether she did not think that women were really happier without all of this. Without all of this, without the vote, the education, the legal rights, the professional access, without the entire apparatus of citizenship that men received as a matter of birth, were women not simply happier without it? The woman presenting, and I wish I knew her name, but the record does not preserve it, apparently paused for a moment, and then she said very quietly, happier than what exactly that exchange has stayed with me since I first encountered it. Because that question, happier than what, is in some ways the question that the entire Victorian era had refused to ask. The comparison had never been permitted. Women's contentment within the system was presented as evidence of the system's correctness without anyone being particularly interested in what women might have felt or achieved or become if the system had been different. That refusal to compare, to imagine otherwise, to take seriously the question of what was being lost. That is the deepest legacy of the ideology we have been tracing all evening. And it did not end with the Victorian era. 1948, Cambridge University finally awards full degrees to women 79 years after Girton College opened its doors and began preparing women for examinations they were not permitted to formally receive credit for. 1961, the contraceptive pill becomes available in the United Kingdom, initially only to married women, fundamentally changing the relationship between women's reproductive lives and their economic and professional choices. 1970, the Equal Pay Act passes in the United Kingdom, legally requiring equal pay for equal work regardless of sex. The act's enforcement in practice was, to put mildly, incomplete for many years, but the principle was now law. 1976. The Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act creates legal remedies specifically for domestic violence within marriage. The first time English law had formally addressed the issue in a systematic way. 1991. Marital rape is finally criminalized in the United Kingdom. The House of Lords, in a case called R versus R, rules that a husband does not have an irrevocable right to intercourse with his wife regardless of her consent. 1991, that is 30 years ago, within the living memory of many people watching this video tonight. The legal principle that a husband effectively owned his wife's body, which we traced back through Victorian cover all the way to Blackstone's definition in 1765, was not formally abolished in English law until 1991. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because I think the timeline genuinely matters when we talk about legacy. This is not ancient history. This is not something safely sealed off in the past. The distance between Victorian England and the present is considerably shorter than we sometimes comfort ourselves by believing. The concept of the mental load is one of the places where I see the most direct and visible inheritance of Victorian domestic ideology in contemporary life. The mental load. The term was popularized by the French cartoonist Emma in 2017, but describes something that had been observed and written about by feminist scholars for decades before. Refers to the invisible cognitive and organizational labor involved in managing a household and a family. Not just the doing of tasks, but the keeping track of what needs to be done, the planning, the anticipating, the remembering, the coordinating. Who is running low on milk when the dentist appointment needs to be booked, what the children need for the school trip next Tuesday, that the bathroom needs new towels, that a birthday card needs to be sent by Friday, that the grocery order needs to account for the fact that someone has a preference that changes week by week. None of these things are difficult individually. The cumulative weight of all of them running continuously in the background of a mind that is also trying to do other things is what the mental load actually is. Study after study in the United Kingdom, the United States, across Europe consistently finds that this cognitive labor falls disproportionately on women in heterosexual partnerships, regardless of whether both partners work full-time. The gap is not imaginary. It is measured, documented, replicated across different cultures and different income levels. And when I think about where that asymmetry comes from, what the roots of it actually are, I find myself back in the Victorian parlor, back in the ideology that defined household management as naturally, inherently feminine, that built the expectation of women's domestic cognitive labor so deeply into the structure of how families operate that it became for many people effectively invisible. The corset is gone. The legal doctrine of coverture is gone. The explicit prescription of the separate spheres is gone. But the assumption that the domestic mental space is primarily women's responsibility. That assumption persisted through all of those legislative changes and cultural shifts and is still in modified form present in millions of households right now. Here's a question I genuinely want you to think about, not rhetorically, but actually. If you grew up in a household where your mother managed the mental load and your father did not, where the invisible cognitive work of the family was distributed in that particular way, what did that teach you about whose responsibility it was? Not consciously, not in a lesson that was explicitly delivered, just in the ambient background assumption that was built into how the household functioned every single day. Because that is how ideology actually transmits. Not through declarations, through the texture of ordinary life, through what seems natural because it is what you have always seen. The Victorian separate spheres ideology was not taught to children as a proposition to be accepted or rejected. It was demonstrated to them daily in every interaction, in every domestic arrangement, in every implicit message about whose work counted and whose did not. It became for the children raised inside. It's simply how things were, the way the world was organized. And when those children grew up and formed their own households, they did not necessarily repeat exactly the same arrangements their parents had. But they started from a baseline that had been established inside them before they had the cognitive capacity to examine it. That process did not stop in 1901 when the Victorian era ended. It did not stop in 1918 when partial suffrage was granted. It continues in modified and evolving forms through every generation that inherits assumptions it did not choose and often cannot fully see. The category of unpaid domestic labor is the economic dimension of this inheritance, and I think it deserves direct attention. A 2016 study by the Office for National Statistics in the United Kingdom attempted to estimate the monetary value of unpaid work, primarily household labor and childcare performed in the country. The figure they arrived at was approximately 1 trillion annually, 1 trillion roughly equivalent to the entire formal output of the country's non-financial services sector. This is work that is performed in its majority by women. Work that produces real economic value that enables paid workers to function. That raises the next generation of citizens, that maintains the physical and social infrastructure of family life. Work that appears nowhere in any GDP calculation. Work that earns no pension, no social security credit, no professional recognition. The Victorian ideology told women that this work was their natural calling, their special gift, the expression of their superior moral nature. It was not the ideology insisted the kind of thing you put a number on. It was above that. The result of that framing the refusal to count it, to value it economically, to build social support systems that recognize its real cost and its real contribution is an inheritance that shapes women's economic lives enormously. Right now, women who take time out of paid work for childcare face pension gaps, career interruption penalties, and lifetime earnings reductions that accumulate over decades. The economic consequences of the domestic ideology are not historical. They are current, measurable, and significant. Let me bring this back to something more personal, because I do not want this to become an abstract economic argument when the heart of it is actually very human. There is a particular kind of conversation that happens. I think in many families across many generations, that is essentially a variation on the same fundamental tension. A woman who has been educated, who has abilities, who has ambitions and interests, and a legitimate claim to a full professional and intellectual life, find herself also carrying the expectation, sometimes explicitly articulated, more often simply assumed by everyone around her, that the domestic and caring responsibilities of the household are primarily hers, not entirely hers necessarily, but primarily in a way that is not quite symmetrical. And she has to decide continuously and without much cultural support for the decision how to navigate that asymmetry, whether to resist it and at what cost, whether to accommodate it and what that accommodation does to the other parts of her life, whether to try to renegotiate it and how to do that in relationships and workplaces and social environments that were built around different assumptions. This is not a Victorian problem that was solved and then left behind. It is a current problem that has Victorian roots. And one of the reasons it is hard to address is that the ideology that created it was specifically designed not conspirator allied, but structurally to be invisible, to seem natural, to present itself not as a choice that society made, but as a reflection of how things simply are. The first step in addressing any of that is being able to see it, to name what it actually is, to understand where it came from and how it got here, which is in some ways what we have been doing all evening. There was a woman I want to mention here who represents for me one of the most important bridges between the Victorian era and the questions we're still navigating. Ellalinina Wybone was born in 1872, the daughter of a prominent social reformer, and she spent her entire adult life working on the specific intersection of women's economic independence and domestic life. She was not primarily a suffragist, though she supported suffrage. Her particular focus was on the economic position of mothers, on the specific financial vulnerability of women whose labor in the home was essential but uncompensated and who were therefore entirely dependent on their husband's income. Her campaign for what she called family allowances, state payments made directly to mothers to recognize and partially compensate their domestic and childcare labor, was controversial in ways that are interesting to examine. It was opposed by some trade unions who feared it would be used to justify lower wages. It was opposed by some conservatives who felt it undermined the model of the male breadwinner. And it was opposed by some feminists who worried it would entrench women in the domestic role rather than enable them to leave it. Rothbone argued patiently and across decades that economic independence for mothers was a prerequisite for any other kind of independence. That a woman who had no income of her own, who depended entirely on her husband's goodwill for every purchase she made, was not in any meaningful sense free, regardless of what the law formally said about her rights. The Family Allowances Act passed in 1945. It provided a weekly payment for each child after the first paid directly to the mother rather than to the father. A deliberate choice that Wybone had argued for, specifically on the grounds that money paid to the mother was more likely to be spent on the children. Ellalinina Wybone had been campaigning for this for 40 years. It strikes me thinking about her story alongside all the others we've told tonight, that the women who actually changed things were overwhelmingly people who were in it for the long game. Not the dramatic gesture, not the moment of confrontation, the sustained, patient, unglamorous work of building the argument, maintaining the coalition, surviving the defeats, and continuing anyway. That kind of commitment is not glamorous. It does not make for great drama, but it is how things actually change. I want to say something about the women whose names we do not know. The ones who did not campaign or write pamphlets or found colleges. The ones who simply lived inside the system we've been describing, did what they could with what they had, and tried in whatever small ways were available to them to make their own lives and their children's lives a little better than the structures around them intended. The woman who taught her daughter to read properly even when the school curriculum did not prioritize it. The woman who kept her own small savings quietly and carefully against the day she might need them. The woman who had opinions about politics and expressed them in the privacy of her kitchen because there was nowhere else she was permitted to express them. The woman who told her son to help with the dishes. The woman who told her daughter that she was clever enough for more than this, even if she could not quite articulate what more looked like. Those women are also the story. The invisible infrastructure of small daily resistances and small daily dignities that nobody wrote pamphlets about and that nobody counted in the economic statistics. Their inheritance is here too in every daughter who grew up believing she was entitled to a full life. Not because any law specifically guaranteed it, but because someone in her family had quietly, stubbornly, consistently demonstrated that she was. The Victorian era ended in 1901. But the questions it raised about the value of domestic labor, about the relationship between economic independence and personal freedom, about whose work counts and whose does not, about the invisible weight of expectation that is passed from generation to generation in the texture of ordinary life. Those questions did not end with it. They're still being answered haltingly, incompletely, in different ways, in different places with setbacks that are sometimes discouraging in progress, that is sometimes so gradual it is hard to see, but being answered, and that I think is the appropriate note on which to arrive at the last part of tonight's story. Not triumph, not the clean resolution that would make a more satisfying narrative arc, but something truer than that. The ongoing nature of things. The fact that change does not arrive in a single moment and then stay arrived. The fact that each generation inherits both the progress its predecessors made and the work they did not quite finish. What we owe to the women who lived and struggled inside the Victorian home is, I think, a clear accounting of what they actually experienced. Not the romanticized version, not the simplified version, but the real one with all its complexity and pain and resilience and contradiction. And then we owe them something else, something harder. The honesty to look at what they left us, including the parts that are uncomfortable, the parts that are still unresolved, the parts that live quietly in our own assumptions and arrangements, and to continue the accounting. That is the final chapter of tonight's story, and it is in some ways the most personal one we will tell, because the last question is not about the Victorians at all. It is about us. The question I want to leave you with tonight is not about the Victorians. It is about you. And I do not mean that in a vague motivational poster kind of way. I mean it quite specifically because I think if we have done this story any justice at all over the last several hours, if we have really looked at what the Victorian home was, what it did, and how it shaped the lives of the women inside it, then the honest conclusion is not simply that things were terrible then and everything is fine now. The honest conclusion is more complicated than that and more interesting. Let me tell you how I want to frame it. In the last part of this story, we talked about the long, patient work of legislative change, the Property Acts, the custody reforms, the suffrage campaigns, the slow dismantling of the legal architecture of cover. We talked about the women who spent decades building those changes brick by careful brick, often without seeing the results in their own lifetimes. What I want to do now is something slightly different. I want to look at what did not change, or rather what changed in form, but continued in substance, because I think that is the more unsettling and more useful question. The separate spheres ideology did not survive the 20th century in its Victorian shape. Nobody today is seriously arguing in mainstream public discourse that women are constitutionally unsuited to intellectual life, or that their physiology makes them unsuited for public roles, or that a married woman's legal identity should be absorbed into her husband's. Those specific arguments are gone, decisively gone. But here's what I've been thinking about. An ideology does not need to survive in its original form to continue shaping reality. It just needs to have been present long enough and pervasive enough to have restructured the environment. The economic structures, the cultural expectations, the unconscious assumptions about how households work and whose time is more valuable, and whose work counts in ways that then perpetuate themselves without requiring anyone to consciously endorse the original argument. The Victorian separate spheres ideology was present for a very long time, and it was extraordinarily pervasive. What did it leave behind? Let's start with a number that I find genuinely striking every time I encounter it. A 2020 study by the United Nations found that globally women perform on average 3 times more unpaid care and domestic work than men. 3 times. This is not a figure from the developing world exclusively. In the United Kingdom, research from the Office for National Statistics found that women perform an average of 60% more unpaid work than men cooking, cleaning, childcare, elderly care, household management. And critically, this gap persists even when both partners work full-time in paid employment. When a woman goes to an office for 8 hours and a man goes to an office for 8 hours, they do not come home to equal amounts of remaining unpaid domestic responsibility. The data consistently and across multiple studies and countries shows that she will do significantly more now. Is that because women are naturally more inclined toward domestic work? Is it biological? Is it simply a preference? I want to take that question seriously rather than dismissing it, because I think it deserves engagement rather than avoidance. The problem with the preference explanation is that preferences do not form in a vacuum. They form in environments. They are shaped by what we observe, what we're encouraged toward, what we're assumed to be responsible for, what we are rewarded for, and what happens when we step back from it. A girl who grows up watching her mother manage the household while her father does not, who internalizes through 1,000 daily observations that domestic management is women's work, is not forming a free preference for domestic work. She is absorbing a pattern, and that pattern has Victorian roots that go down several generations. The ideology that defined domestic labor as naturally feminine was not arbitrary. It was a system that served specific economic and social purposes, and it was enforced through law, medicine, religion, and culture for the better part of the century and beyond. The fact that the enforcement mechanisms have been largely removed does not automatically undo the pattern they created. Patterns once established are self-replicating. That is what makes them patterns. There is a concept in economics called the gender pay gap, and I want to approach it from a slightly different angle than it usually receives. The headline number in the United Kingdom in recent years has been somewhere around 15 to 18%, meaning that for every pound a man earns, a woman earns approximately 82 to 85. The gap is real, documented, and persistent. But what drives it? The simple explanation that women are paid less for doing identical work is only part of the picture. Research into the causes of the gap consistently finds that a significant portion of it is driven by something else. The career penalties associated with time taken out of paid employment for childcare and the clustering of women in lower paid sectors that are not coincidentally the sectors most associated with caring and domestic skills. In other words, the economy rewards the kinds of work that were historically assigned to men, the technical, the analytical, the publicly facing, the competitive, more generously than it rewards the kinds of work historically assigned to women. And women who take time away from paid work to perform the unpaid domestic and caring work that keeps families functioning pay an economic penalty that compounds over decades. That is not a coincidence. It is the economic legacy of a century in which domestic work was defined as valueless, as not work, as merely natural, as the expression of feminine virtue rather than labor deserving compensation. The devaluation was built into the structure. It does not require active discrimination to perpetuate. It just requires the structure to remain in place. I want to be careful here because I am aware that this is the kind of territory where it is easy to either overstate things dramatically or flatten genuine complexity. So let me be precise about what I am, and I'm not saying that nothing has changed. An enormous amount has changed. The legal changes we discussed, the educational access, the professional opportunities, these are real and they matter enormously. The life available to a woman in 21st century Britain or America or most of Western Europe is incomparably broader than the life available to a Victorian woman. And that difference is the direct result of the work of the women we've been talking about all evening. I'm also not saying that all domestic arrangements today are problematic or that women who prefer to focus on domestic and family life are somehow suffering from false consciousness. Human beings make choices within complex environments, and those choices deserve to be respected. What I'm saying is more specific. I am saying that when we look at contemporary data on the distribution of domestic labor, the gender pay gap, the career penalties associated with childcare, and the persistent undervaluation of caring work, and when we trace those patterns backward, we find Victorian roots. We find the residue of an ideology that was so thoroughly embedded in social, legal, economic, and cultural structures that it continues to shape reality even in the absence of the belief system that created it. Understanding that does not make the problems easier to solve, but it does make them easier to see. And seeing as Barbara Lee Smith Bodden understood in 1854 when she published her plain language guide to women's legal situation is always the necessary first step. There's one more thing I want to say, and it is perhaps the thing I most want you to carry away from tonight's story. Every part of this evening, from the first part through to this one, has been a story about the gap between what women were told they were and what they actually were. Between the angel in the house and the actual human being living inside that construction. Between the legal non-person and the woman who kept the accounts raised, the children managed the household, supported the salon, wrote the pamphlets, coded the diaries, built the colleges, and changed the law. The women we have talked about tonight did not fit the story that was told about them. And rather than making themselves fit, rather than compressing and corseting their inner lives the way they compressed and corseted their bodies, the most remarkable of them found ways to insist on a different story, a more accurate one. They did it in drawing rooms and diary entries and coded journals and legal briefs and parliamentary petitions and novels and laboratory results and examination scores. They did it quietly and then less quietly. They did it at personal cost that we should not minimize and with a patience and determination that genuinely moves me when I think about it. And they did it fundamentally because they trusted something. They trusted that the truth about who they were and what they were capable of was more durable than any ideology that denied it. That you can suppress evidence for a long time, but the evidence keeps accumulating. That a story told forcefully enough and long enough by the people with power will eventually meet the reality it was trying to contain. They were right about that. Slowly, incompletely, expensively, painfully, they were right. I want to close tonight with a woman we've not mentioned yet, because I have been saving her specifically for this moment. Her name was Octavia Hill. She was born in 1838, the granddaughter of a public health reformer, and she spent her adult life doing something that sounds almost mundane when you describe it. She managed housing for the poor. Specifically, she bought rundown properties in London's most deprived neighborhoods, renovated them to basic habitability, and then rented them to working-class families at fair rents, managing the properties herself with a combination of firm business sense and genuine human concern for the people who lived in them. She trained teams of women rent collectors who visited the properties regularly, not just to collect money, but to maintain relationships, identify needs, and connect families with whatever support existed. By the time she was in her 50s, Octavia Hill was managing housing for thousands of families across London. She had essentially invented a form of social housing management that was later adopted by local authorities across the country. She was also one of the 3 co-founders in 1895 of the National Trust, an organization that today protects over 600 m of coastline and hundreds of historic properties across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. She did all of this without ever holding a formal public office because women could not hold formal public offices for most of her active career. She did it through relationship, through competence, through the slow accumulation of trust and results, through exactly the kinds of skills that the Victorian domestic ideology had insisted were merely natural feminine attributes rather than professional capacities deserving institutional recognition. She took the tools the ideology had given her, the domestic skills, the relational intelligence, the capacity for patient detail-oriented management, and she used them to build something that outlasted the ideology entirely. I find something deeply satisfying about that. There's a kind of poetic justice in it. The qualities that were supposed to keep women contained ended up being the qualities they used to build institutions that are still functioning, still protecting, still serving people more than a century after the women who built them are gone. The Victorian home was a cage. We've been honest about that all evening, and I do not want to soften it now at the end. But it was a cage full of people who were more than the cage was designed to hold. And that excess, that overflow of intelligence, capability, ambition, resilience, creativity, and sheer human refusal to be entirely defined by someone else's story about what you are. That excess is the most important thing the Victorian era produced. Not the architecture, though the architecture is beautiful. Not the literature, though the literature is extraordinary. Not the science, not the empire, not the economic expansion. The most important thing the Victorian era produced was the quiet, sustained, incredibly expensive proof that you cannot fully contain what people are by defining what they are allowed to be. The women we have talked about tonight, from Caroline Norton arguing in pamphlets for the right to see her children, to Philip of Fawcett sitting perfectly still while the announcement of her examination result rippled through a room that had not expected it, to the anonymous woman in Bethlehem writing in an unsent letter that grief and illness are not the same thing. All of them were making the same argument in different registers, in different languages, in different moments. The argument was simple and it was true. We are here. We are more than this. Count us. If there is a reason to study history, and I believe there is genuinely and without reservation, it is not nostalgia. It is not the comfort of a world simpler than our own. It is not even the pleasure of a good story, though tonight has had some of those. The reason to study history, as I understand it, is so that we can see ourselves more clearly, so that we can look at the assumptions we carry without examining them and ask where they came from, so that we can trace the origins of the patterns we live inside and decide with open eyes which of them we want to keep and which of them we want to change. The Victorian women we have spent tonight with did that work for themselves at enormous cost and passed the results forward. The least we can do is receive what they passed forward with the clarity and honesty it deserves, not as a comfortable story about how far we have come, but as an ongoing conversation about where we are going. And with that, genuinely thank you for spending tonight's story with me. If something we talked about tonight stayed with you, I would love to know what it was. Drop it in the comments. Tell me which woman's story surprised you most, or which part of this history you had never encountered before. These conversations matter to me more than I can easily say. And every comment you leave tells me something about what you want to explore next. If tonight meant something to you, if it gave you something to think about, something to look up, something to bring into a conversation with someone you love, please share it with them. The best thing this channel can do is put stories that deserve to be told into the hands of people who will carry them forward. And if you're new here and you found your way to this video somehow, hello, welcome. I am genuinely glad you are here. There's a lot more where this came from. Rest well tonight. You have earned it.